The girl was 6 years old, maybe 7, crouched behind a broken vending machine in the parking lot of a motel that should have been condemned 3 winters ago. She had no coat, no shoes, just a thin hospital bracelet circling her tiny wrist, and eyes that had already learned how to calculate the distance between herself and the nearest exit. Cade Mercer saw her at 11:47 p.m. on the coldest night Michigan had thrown at anyone in a decade, and when he killed his engine and the Harley went silent beneath him, she didn't run. She looked at him, all 210 pounds of leather and scar tissue, and whispered something that cut straight through the wind. "You gonna kill me, mister?" Cade had survived 2 combat tours, a collapsed marriage, and a knife wound that still ached every time rain was coming. But those 5 words stopped him cold in a way nothing else ever had. If this story already has your chest tight, you're exactly where this channel lives. Subscribe and hit the bell right now, because every week we ride into the darkest corners of loyalty, betrayal, and the people nobody expected to save anyone. Drop your city and your country in the comments below. Let's see how far this story travels. This one goes all the way to the end. Don't you dare leave early. The drive had been pointless from the start. Cade had taken Route 9 north out of Harlan Creek because he needed the cold and the dark and the specific kind of silence that only comes when you're moving fast enough that your own thoughts can't catch you. 3 hours out and 3 hours back. No destination, no reason. Just the Harley between his knees and the blacktop unrolling beneath him like a sentence he never had to finish. He'd been doing that more often lately. Since Marcus died in October. Since the funeral where nobody from the club cried except Denny, who cried at everything, and Cade stood in the back with his jaw locked and his hands shoved into his jacket pockets, feeling the specific shame of a man who knew he should feel more than he did and couldn't figure out why he didn't. Marcus had been his road brother for 11 years, and at the graveside, Cade had thought mostly about tire pressure. There was something wrong with him. He'd known it for years. The VA therapist he'd seen exactly twice had used the phrase emotional compartmentalization, and he'd driven home thinking it sounded like a feature rather than a problem. He hadn't gone back. The motel appeared around a long bend in the state highway, its vacancy sign flickering with the kind of determination that bordered on tragedy. Half the letters had given up. The parking lot was cracked asphalt and old ice, 3 cars arranged with the randomness of abandonment rather than occupation, and the whole structure sagged slightly at the roofline like something that had been holding its breath too long. Cade had no reason to pull in. He pulled in anyway. Later, he would tell Denny it was because he needed to stretch. He would tell Detective Voss it was instinct. In the quiet of his own head, he never fully explained it, even to himself. Something about the parking lot looked wrong. Something about the arrangement of shadows near the east wall, near the defunct vending machine with its cracked face and dark interior, the one that used to dispense things before it was left here to rust into the concrete. He cut the engine. The silence came in hard and immediate, the way silence always does after road noise. Overwhelming, almost tactile. Wind moved across the lot with a thin metallic edge. His breath fogged. He sat on the bike for a moment, not moving, just reading the space the way combat had taught him to read spaces. Then the shadow behind the vending machine moved. He didn't reach for anything. He didn't shout. He just swung off the bike slowly, boots connecting with gravel, and walked toward the machine at an angle that wasn't quite direct. The same approach you'd use with something wounded in the field, something that might bolt or bite, depending on how wrong you got the angle. She was pressed into the gap between the machine and the cinder block wall. She'd made herself as small as possible, arms wrapped around her own knees, bare feet on frozen concrete. The hospital bracelet caught the distant flicker of the motel sign. She was wearing a pink shirt with a cartoon character on it that had been washed so many times the image had nearly disappeared, and thin cotton pants that were no protection against a night that was sitting at 12 degrees Fahrenheit and falling. Her eyes were enormous, dark, and calculating in a way that no child's eyes should ever be. She looked at him the way you look at something when you're trying to determine whether it's going to hurt you before it gets the chance. He stopped, crouched down slowly so he wasn't towering over her. Let her see his hands. "Hey," he said. She didn't answer. "You're not wearing shoes." Still nothing, but her eyes moved to his boots, then back to his face, performing the same calculation again. "I'm not going to come any closer," he said. I'm just going to stay right here and figure out what you need. A long moment passed. The wind pushed between them. Are you going to kill me, mister? The question arrived so quietly, so matter-of-factly, that for a half-second he thought he'd misheard it. Then it landed fully. He felt it in his sternum, the way you feel a close detonation. Not the sound, but the pressure, the displacement, the physical fact of the thing. A 6-year-old, asking that question like it was a reasonable one. Like she'd learned to ask it because the answer had not always been no. No, he said. The word came out rough, and he didn't try to smooth it. No, I'm not. She studied him. Whatever system she was running inside that small, frozen, terrified mind, it processed the answer for a long time. Okay, she finally said. It wasn't trust. It was more like a provisional, contingent, heavily conditional neutrality. It was the most heartbreaking okay he'd ever heard in his life. He called 911 from 10 feet away, turning slightly so she could see he was using a phone and nothing else. He kept his voice low and steady. He gave the location. He said there was a child, approximate age 6, no coat, no shoes, temperature dropping, and that he would remain on scene until units arrived. When he ended the call, he took off his leather jacket, patches and all, Iron Saint's rocker on the back, the skull and wrench insignia that had meant something different to him at 25 than it did now at 35, and held it out toward her at arm's length without moving his feet. She looked at it for a very long time. Then she reached out and took it. She pulled it around herself like a blanket, disappearing inside it, the hem dragging on the concrete. Something in his ribcage did something it hadn't done in months. He didn't examine it. He just turned so his back was to the wind and put himself between her and the direction it was coming from, and he stayed there, not speaking, until the lights appeared at the end of the road. 2 county sheriff's vehicles. Then an ambulance. Then, irritatingly, a third vehicle he didn't recognize until it stopped and Detective Naomi Voss got out, which meant someone at dispatch had flagged this call as something more than a routine welfare check, which meant this wasn't the first time something like this had come through from this specific location. He filed that observation away. Old habit. The girl, who would not give her name, who did not give her name for the next 4 hours, who sat in the back of the ambulance wrapped in emergency mylar and still wearing Cade's jacket over it like armor, watched everything from beneath the hood of that jacket with those enormous calculating eyes. She answered direct questions with silence and redirected questions with more silence, and only spoke once during the entire initial assessment, when a female deputy crouched down and asked her very gently if there was anyone else she wanted them to know about. The other kids, she said, and then stopped. What other kids, sweetheart? She pulled the jacket tighter. Nothing else came. Naomi Voss intercepted Cade before he could follow the ambulance inside the motel's office, which a deputy had already identified as the building's most structurally sound room and converted into an informal interview space within about 4 minutes of arrival. Voss was 41, compact, with close-cropped hair, and the kind of measured stillness that Cade associated with people who had learned to neutralize their own reactions as a professional requirement. She looked at him with flat assessment eyes. You found her? Yes. You were just driving by? Yes. At midnight, on Route 9. That a problem? She didn't answer that. You Iron Saints? That a problem? Depends, she said, on how complicated you're planning to make my night. I'm not planning to make your night anything, he said. I found a kid. I called it in. I'd like to know she's okay. She's being evaluated. EMTs say mild hypothermia, some contusions, dehydrated. She'll be okay physically. Voss paused on that last word in a way that said everything about the rest of it. We're going to need a statement. I know. And then you're free to go. I heard you. Something moved across her face. Not quite frustration, not quite respect. Something in between. She turned back toward the motel, and he stood in the cold and watched her go and thought about the girl's question. Are you going to kill me, mister? Past tense wouldn't leave him. Not will you, but gonna. The future tense compressed into something that had already been decided by prior experience. A child who had asked that question before, or who had heard it asked, or who had understood from context that it was the relevant question to be asking. He thought about the hospital bracelet. He'd seen it clearly when she reached for the jacket. White plastic. Printed logo in blue. A small stylized sun with a hand reaching up from below it. He knew that logo. He'd seen it on donation boxes in the clubhouse. He'd seen it on the charity banquet program from 2 years ago, the one where the Iron Saints had raised $37,000 in a single night, and VP Garrett had gotten emotional during the toast, and everyone had pretended not to notice. He'd seen it on the acknowledgement plaque that still hung by the bar. Sunrise. Promise Foundation. The Iron Saints had been proud supporters of Sunrise Promise for 6 years. He stood in that parking lot for a long time after the ambulance left, the cold working through his flannel because he'd given his jacket to a 6-year-old, and he turned that bracelet logo over in his mind, and something that had started as a vague wrongness in his gut began sharpening into something with harder edges. The next 48 hours were the kind that leave marks. He gave his statement. He went home. He didn't sleep. He sat at his kitchen table with a mug of coffee that went cold while he was staring past it, and he let his mind work the way it worked when it didn't want to stop. Methodically, laterally, following threads that most people wouldn't notice were connected. He'd been a combat medic. He'd triaged things under conditions where the consequence of wrong assessment was someone dying. He'd learned to think in a specific way. It had cost him his marriage and probably most of his emotional range, but it was useful now in the middle of the night with a cold cup of coffee and the image of a bracelet he couldn't stop seeing. The other kids. She'd said it like it was specific. Not are there other kids? Not maybe there are other kids. The other kids. Definite article. Known quantity. She knew who she was talking about. He called Denny at 6 in the morning. Denny Bishop was the Iron Saints' unofficial historian, the guy who kept every piece of paper the club had ever generated because he didn't trust digital storage and because, as he frequently said, paper didn't get hacked. He was also 63 years old, perpetually aggrieved, and answered the phone like it had personally wronged him, regardless of the hour. What? Sunrise Promise, Cade said. I need everything we have on them. A pause. It's 6 in the morning. I know. Cade. Denny, please. Another pause, longer. Denny had known him for 11 years. He heard something in the pleas that he didn't argue with. Give me a couple hours, he said, and hung up. The Sunrise Promise Foundation had been founded 14 years ago, according to its website, by a man named Vincent Harrow, former social services administrator, philanthropist, and the kind of person whose LinkedIn photo had been professionally lit in a way that said trustworthy from 15 feet away. The foundation's stated mission was to provide transitional housing, counseling, and educational support for children aging out of or displaced from the foster care system. They had 5-star ratings on every charitable review platform. They had a wall of endorsements from county officials, state representatives, and 2 former governors. They had a gala every spring that Cade had attended once and found aggressively pleasant in a way he couldn't quite articulate as suspicious, but couldn't quite stop feeling suspicious about. He was reading their annual reports when Denny called back. I've got the donation records, the banquet files, and the correspondence folder from when we first partnered with them, Denny said. What are you looking for? I don't know yet. Can you bring it over? Denny arrived at 9 with a cardboard box and a thermos of actual hot coffee, which Cade accepted with the gratitude of a man who had been running on cold dregs for hours. They spread the files across the kitchen table and worked through them in companionable near silence, which was the mode Cade preferred and which Denny had learned to accept years ago. Most of it looked clean. Or rather, most of it looked like clean was what it was designed to look like. It was Denny who found the first anomaly, almost by accident, looking at the 2021 banquet program while Cade was cross-referencing donor lists. This address, he said, tapping the program. The Foundation's administrative office on Meridian Street. I drove past there last year for something else. Building's empty. Empty how? Empty like nobody's been there for a while. Windows got that filmed overlook. Cade looked at the address. Then he looked at the Foundation's current website. Different address listed, different city. They moved, he said. Sure. Or they never used that address for what they said they used it for. Denny shrugged. Could be nothing. Could be, Cade said, and wrote it down. He drove to the hospital that afternoon. Not to see the girl. Detective Voss had made it exceptionally clear that access to the child was restricted to medical staff, law enforcement, and the child advocate who'd been assigned to her case, a woman named Elena Cross, whose voicemail message was brisk and professional and who had not called him back. He drove to the hospital because he wanted to be closer to the question. He sat in the parking structure for 20 minutes, drinking vending machine coffee and feeling useless in the specific way that felt like it might become useful if he gave it enough time. A woman in a charcoal coat walked across the parking lot below him with the pace of someone who was managing 14 things simultaneously and hadn't chosen to be late, but hadn't chosen to be on time either. She had dark hair pulled back severely and reading glasses pushed up on her head like she'd forgotten them there. She was on the phone. Her voice carried in the cold air. "Not releasing anything to the media until I know how she got there. Do you understand me? Not her name, not her age, not what she was wearing, nothing." Elena Cross. He knew it before he confirmed it by watching her badge herself through the side entrance. He didn't try to follow. He wasn't stupid. But he sat there a while longer watching the entrance and thought about the foundation, and thought about the bracelet, and thought about a child who asked strangers if they were going to kill her with the flat effect of someone running a standard pre-flight checklist. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer. "Mr. Mercer?" The voice was male. Careful. Middle-aged. The particular quality of careful that people deploy when they want to sound casual, but aren't. "My name isn't important right now. What's important is that you found Lucy last night." He went very still. "Who is this?" "Someone who's been trying to find her for 3 months," the voice said. "Someone who found something in the Foundation's books that I wasn't supposed to find, and who has been trying to figure out who to give it to ever since, because the people who should care about it keep turning out to be connected to the people who made the books look wrong in the first place." Cade's hand tightened on the phone. "What did you find?" he said. A pause. In that pause, he could hear the man breathing, could hear traffic somewhere behind him, could hear the precise quality of someone calculating risk in real time and deciding, just barely, to come down on the side of speaking. "Payment records," the voice said. "Transfers out of the Foundation's Transitional Housing Fund. Not to housing, to a series of LLCs registered in 3 different states. And those LLCs have one thing in common besides the money." "What?" "They all lease properties. Motels, farmhouses, rural properties. All remote. All with high turnover on whatever occupancy records they bother to keep." The man paused again. "I can show you the documents, but not on the phone. And not somewhere they might be watching." Cade looked at the hospital entrance where Elena Cross had disappeared. "The other kids," he said quietly, mostly to himself. "There are more," the voice said. And the way he said it, the weight under it, the specific gravity of confirmed knowledge rather than suspicion, made the parking structure feel 10 degrees colder than it already was. "Tell me where," Cade said. The man gave him an address. A diner on the county line, Tuesday morning, 7 a.m. A booth in the back. Cade would know him, he said, by the manila envelope on the table, and the fact that he'd look like a man who hadn't slept since he'd made the worst discovery of his career. "One more thing," the voice said, just before ending the call. "Yeah. They know she's been found, whoever's running this. They know within hours of something happening, which means they have someone watching. Could be inside the sheriff's department, could be the hospital, could be somewhere else." A pause that lasted exactly long enough to mean something. "The charity gala is in 3 weeks. Every year they use it to move things around, reorganize, disappear the paper trail for another 12 months. If this doesn't break before then..." The call ended. Cade sat in the parking structure with the dead phone in his hand and the cold coming up through the concrete and a number in his head. 3 weeks. And the understanding, arriving slow and inevitable as frost, that Lucy had not been alone in whatever she'd been running from. That the bracelet on her wrist connected to something built inside an institution his club had stood behind, donated to, publicly championed, shaken hands in front of for 6 years. That somewhere between the gala photographs and the 5-star ratings and the professional smiles, someone had built something unforgivable. He thought about her question again. "Are you going to kill me, mister?" He thought about her voice saying "the other kids," and then stopping, going quiet, pulling the jacket tighter. And he thought, whoever is protecting them is inside the system.
Whoever is protecting the people hurting them is someone with a badge or a title or a desk in a building with good lighting and donor plaques on the wall, which meant the only people who could move freely, who existed outside the institutional lines that someone had already compromised, who could follow a thread into the dark without anyone in the dark knowing they were coming. He started the bike. The engine turned over with a sound like a decision being made. He had 6 days before the unknown auditor expected him at that diner. He had 3 weeks before whatever window existed would close. He had a club that trusted him, even when they didn't understand him, and a detective who watched him with flat, careful eyes and hadn't told him to get lost yet, and a child advocate who hadn't returned his call, but who was still in that building, still in that room, still trying. He also had 6 years of donation records, a building on Meridian Street that nobody had used for what the paperwork said, and a set of LLC names that a man on an unknown number had just told him all led somewhere cold and remote and wrong. The Iron Saints had built their reputation on one principle above every other. You don't leave someone behind in the dark if you have the means to reach them. He rode out of the parking structure into the gray Michigan afternoon and pointed the bike toward the clubhouse. And what he felt was not hope exactly, and not rage exactly, but something that sat between them and burned cleaner than either. He didn't know yet that by morning his name would be in the local news, that by Tuesday the man with the manila envelope would have gone silent, that Vincent Harrow already knew who found Lucy, and that what was coming for Cade Mercer next would not come in the dark. It would come smiling, in daylight, wearing the face of a man who had learned that the most dangerous thing you can do to a protector is make everyone else afraid of him first. The clubhouse smelled the same way it always had. Motor oil, old wood, the ghost of 1,000 cigarettes absorbed into the walls over decades, until the smell was structural, load-bearing, part of what held the building up. Cade had walked through that door more times than he could count, and the smell had always meant something uncomplicated. Home. Brotherhood. The specific relief of being somewhere that didn't require explanation. Tonight it felt different. Tonight it felt like a room he was about to change permanently, just by saying what he came to say. 8 men around the long table. President Garrett Hale at the head, 52 years old, built like something carved from a material that didn't soften, with a silver beard and hands that had fixed engines and thrown punches and held dying men with equal steadiness over 30 years of living the only way he'd known how. Sergeant-at-Arms Boyd Crenna to his left, forearms like bridge cables, a scar along his jawline from something nobody talked about anymore. Treasurer Ray Folsom, thin and precise, the only man in the club who wore reading glasses unironically, and 4 others, Pike, Jonesy, Dub, and Little Cal, who was 6'3" and had earned the name at a different point in his life. Denny was there too, standing against the wall. He'd called ahead. Cade laid it out. All of it. The girl in the parking lot, the bracelet, the call from the unknown number, the Meridian Street address that Denny had confirmed as vacant, the LLC trail, the 3-week window before the gala. He spoke for 11 minutes without interruption, which was unusual for this room. When he finished, the silence that followed had texture to it. Wait. The kind of silence that means everyone in the room is doing the same calculation and nobody has arrived at a comfortable answer. Garrett spoke first. You got a call from a man who won't give you his name, telling you there's a trafficking ring running through a charity we've been publicly associated with for 6 years. Yes. And your evidence right now is a kid with a bracelet and an empty building. And the LLCs. And the payment records the man described. I'll have the physical documents Tuesday. If he shows. Garrett leaned back in his chair. The leather creaked. He looked at the ceiling for a moment with the expression of a man reviewing every decision he'd made in the past 6 years and trying to determine which ones he'd have to answer for. Sunrise Promise, Boyd said from his left. The name came out flat, like he was testing how much it weighed. Yeah. We raised $37,000 for those people. I know. Boyd's jaw tightened. I shook that man's hand. Harrow. At the banquet. Stood next to him for the photograph. He said it the way you say a thing when you're deciding whether you're angry or sick and haven't landed yet. I know, Cade said again. Ray Folsom took his glasses off and set them on the table with careful precision. What you're describing, if it's real, is something federal agencies have jurisdiction over. This isn't a club matter. This isn't even a county matter. The county has a leak, Cade said. The unknown caller said it himself, someone watching from inside. Law enforcement, hospital, doesn't know which. But the safe house near Denton got cleared out 2 hours before a planned raid last spring. He'd found that too, in the course of the night. A local news brief, 4 paragraphs, buried. Authorities arrived at property to find it vacant. That's not coincidence. You don't know that's connected, Ray said. No, not yet. Cade? Garrett's voice had a particular quality when he used a man's name like that. Not sharp, not gentle, something that sat in between and meant, I need you to hear what I'm actually saying. If we start pulling threads on Sunrise Promise, we are putting this club in the center of a story that looks very bad for us from the outside. A biker club investigating a children's charity. You understand how that reads? I understand. Do you? Because right now you look like a man who found a lost kid and decided to make it his entire life in about 12 hours. Cade didn't answer that. Something moved across Garrett's face. Not cruelty. Garrett wasn't cruel. Something harder than concern and softer than dismissal. Go home, he said. Get some sleep. Wait for Tuesday. See if your source shows. Then we talk again. And if he doesn't show? Then we talk again anyway. Garrett's eyes were steady. But we don't move on anything until we have something real to move on. That's not fear. That's how we've survived 30 years without becoming what people think we are. Cade held his gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once, picked up his keys, and walked out. He didn't sleep. He sat at his kitchen table with the Sunrise Promise annual report spread across the surface and a legal pad filling up with notes and connections and questions that kept generating more questions instead of answers. The coffee went cold. He made more. The night moved through its hours the way nights do when you're not sleeping, slowly, with an awareness of each individual minute, the way you're only ever aware of time when you can't stop thinking about what's inside it. He called the number back. The unknown caller. It rang 4 times and went to a voicemail that said only, "Leave a message." He left his name and said he'd be at the diner Tuesday. He hung up and looked at the phone for a while and thought about the quality of silence on a line that goes to voicemail versus a line that's been disconnected. It had rung. That was something. Monday passed in the particular way that days pass when you're waiting for something and trying to appear not to be. He drove the Meridian Street address in the afternoon, a 3-story brick building that had been commercial space, locked ground floor units with the filmed-over windows Denny had described. No signage, no activity. He photographed the exterior. He noted the property management company listed on the small placard by the door, Galloway Properties, LLC. He added Galloway Properties to his list. That evening, Naomi Voss called him. "How did you get this number?" he said. "You're listed," she said. "Mr. Mercer, I want to be straightforward with you." "Appreciated." "The girl, Lucy, is stable. She's been placed with a temporary foster family with CPS oversight while we conduct our investigation. She's talking more. Not much, but more." A pause. She asked about the man with the motorcycle. He didn't trust himself to respond immediately, so he didn't. "She wanted to know if you were in trouble," Voss continued. Her voice had a different quality than it had in the parking lot. Still measured, still controlled, but something had been adjusted, like she'd recalibrated the angle slightly. She said, and this is a direct quote, "He was nice. Some of the men were nice at first, but then they weren't. He was different." The room was very quiet. "What men?" Cade said. "We're working on that." Another pause. "Mr. Mercer, I know what you're doing. I know you pulled the Foundation's records. I know you drove to Meridian Street this afternoon." He went still. "I'm not here to warn you off," she said, which was not what he'd expected. "I'm here to tell you that if you find something that I can use, you bring it to me. Not to the county sheriff's tip line, not to the media, to me, directly. Because I agree with you that there's a problem, and I don't know yet how deep it runs. And until I know, I'm only sure of a handful of people." She paused one more time, and he had the sense she was choosing her next words with the same care you use around something that might break. "You're currently on that list. I don't know why. Don't make me regret it." She gave him a direct cell number. "The gala," he said before she could hang up. 3 weeks. She was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said. "Work faster," and ended the call. Tuesday morning arrived gray and cold, a flat Michigan sky pressing down on everything, the kind of morning that makes the world look like it's been photocopied slightly off-center. The diner sat on the county line with its parking lot half full of early shift workers' trucks and its interior foggy with short-order cook steam and the smell of burned coffee that had been sitting since 5 a.m. Cade walked in at 6:52, booth in the back. He saw it immediately. The manila envelope, fat and slightly bent, sitting on the Formica tabletop in front of a man who looked exactly the way the voice on the phone had predicted he'd look. 50-something, gray at the temples, with the specific hollowness around the eyes that comes not from not sleeping, but from sleeping, and still not escaping. He wore a dark sweater and a wedding ring, and the expression of someone who had made a decision he knew was going to cost him something significant and was still processing the full invoice. Cade slid into the opposite seat, said nothing, ordered coffee from the server without looking away from the man. "Marcus Webb," the man said. Not a question. "Cade Mercer." Webb looked at him for a moment. The jacket, the Iron Saints patch, the scar that ran along the left side of his jaw from a piece of shrapnel he'd caught in Kandahar that the field surgeon had picked out with forceps while Cade counted ceiling tiles. "You're not what I expected." "Most people say that." Webb slid the envelope across the table. 14 months of payment records, cross-referenced with LLC registration filings I pulled from 3 state databases. The transfers start small. Bob. They always start small. That's how it works. You build the pattern so small that any single transaction looks like administrative variance. Then they get larger. And the properties that receive the funding, he stopped, collected himself. "I've been an auditor for 22 years. I've seen embezzlement. I've seen creative accounting. I've never seen anything built this carefully to look like something it wasn't." Cade didn't touch the envelope yet. "How did you find it?" "I was brought in to do a routine compliance review. Third party, independent. The foundation needed it for their government grant renewal." Webb wrapped both hands around his coffee mug like he was trying to draw warmth from it. "I wasn't supposed to be thorough. I think they assumed I'd be cursory. Most compliance reviews are. You check the boxes, you file the report, you move on." He looked at the table. "I was thorough." "Who knows you found it?" "My firm, which means whoever retained my firm might know, if there's been any communication I'm not aware of." He looked up. "I told my wife I was helping a friend with paperwork. That's all she knows. That's all I want her to know." Cade looked at him steadily. "You could have gone to federal law enforcement." "I tried." Webb's voice went flat. "I made contact with an FBI field office. I was told my information was being noted and that an investigator would follow up. That was 9 weeks ago." He shook his head slowly. "Then I tried the state AG's office. Same pattern. Noted, pending, will follow up. And in the meantime, 2 of the properties in those records, 2 that I could identify by address, had their registration updated. Not dissolved, not flagged, updated. New operating names, new listed managers, same parent LLC, 1 layer deeper in the structure." He looked at Cade directly. "Someone told them. Someone who received my information told the people I was reporting." The coffee arrived. Cade wrapped a hand around the mug but didn't drink. "Why me?" he said. "Because you found her," Webb said simply. "Because when I saw the news brief about a child found outside the Milford Road motel, because I recognized that motel, mister. Mercer, it's on page 9 of what's in that envelope. I thought, whoever stopped there in the middle of the night and called it in instead of driving away is either exactly what I need or the most dangerous mistake I've ever made." He paused. "I decided to believe the first one." Cade took the envelope. He didn't open it there. He tucked it inside his jacket, against his chest, and he sat with Marcus Webb for another 20 minutes, drinking coffee that tasted like it had been filtered through a coal deposit, and listening to everything else Webb had to say, which was considerable, which filled in parts of the picture he'd been building in his head and changed the shape of other parts in ways that made the whole thing worse. The gala wasn't just a fundraiser. According to the financial patterns Webb had tracked, it served as an annual reset, a moment when money moved, when property records updated, when the administrative architecture of the organization shifted just enough to make the prior year's trail harder to follow. Every year for at least 5 years, in the weeks following the gala, several of the LLC properties would go dark or rebrand. Every year new properties would appear, new leases, new registered agents. The gala wasn't 3 weeks away. It had been moved. Moved when? Cade said. 11 days, Webb said. The announcement went out Friday. Venue change, they said. Logistics. He shook his head. 11 days. Cade drove back to Harlan Creek with the envelope against his chest and the number 11 turning over in his head and the gray sky pressing down on everything and the Harley's engine the only warm thing in the world. He called Voss from the road. Voicemail. He left the number 11 on it and nothing else and trusted that she was as fast as she'd implied. She called back in 40 minutes. He was pulling into the clubhouse lot. Tell me everything he gave you, she said, and her voice had a different quality again, sharper, the way a line goes taut when something on the other end pulls hard. He told her. She listened without interrupting, which he was starting to understand was her version of extreme focus. When he finished, she was quiet for 3 seconds. The venue change was announced internally 2 days before it went public, she said, which means someone connected to that organization knew by Thursday. What happened Thursday? A pause that lasted exactly long enough to tell him something had happened Thursday. Thursday morning, Voss said carefully, an anonymous tip came through the county sheriff's tip line, describing a biker affiliated with the Iron Saints MC who had reportedly been seen attempting to access a hospitalized minor. The tip was flagged to the duty sergeant and routed to the department's community liaison officer for follow-up. The engine ticked as it cooled. That's not a coincidence, he said. No, she agreed. It's not. Another pause. Mr. Mercer. The duty sergeant who received that flag is a man named Del Rourke. I have been trying to find a reason to trust Sergeant Rourke for 6 weeks, and I haven't found one. I want you to understand what that means about the tip line I told you not to use. Understood. I need those documents, physical, today, before end of business. I'll come to you. No. We don't know who's watching either end of that equation. There's a coffee place on 14th called Harmon's. Back table, east side. Leave the envelope with the owner. Her name is Gia. She's my CI, and she's been clean for 8 years, and she will not ask you a single question. He wrote it down. He drove to Harmon's. Gia was 50, with paint-stained fingers and the particular eyes of someone who had been in proximity to difficult things for a long time and developed the ability to be present without reacting. She took the envelope, put it under the counter, and handed him a cup of coffee on the house without saying a word. He drove back to the clubhouse and went inside. Garrett was there. Alone, which was unusual. He was at the bar with a glass of something amber and an expression that Cade had only seen a handful of times in 11 years. The one that meant something had arrived that Garrett didn't have a clean way to handle. Sit down, Garrett said. Cade sat. Garrett pushed a newspaper across the bar. Not a newspaper, a printout. A local news site, posted this morning. The headline read, Iron Saints MC, Member Questions Child Following Late Night Encounter. Below it, a photograph. Him, at the hospital parking structure. Shot from a distance, slightly blurred, but identifiably him, on his bike. He read the article in 45 seconds. It was short and careful and deliberately vague, which made it more damaging than something specific would have been, because vague left room for the reader to imagine freely. It mentioned an unnamed member of the Iron Saints who had been present when an unidentified child was found, who had subsequently been seen at the hospital where the child was recovering, who had made inquiries that sources described as concerning. Sources. This came out at 9 this morning, Garrett said. His voice was very controlled. By 10, I had calls from 2 of our charity event sponsors pulling their commitments for next year's fundraiser. By 11, I had a call from State Representative Carl Dobbin's office, who, as you know, has appeared at our Veterans Benefit Ride for the past 4 years, telling me that he'd be taking a temporary step back from the association pending clarification of the situation. Garrett's hands were flat on the bar, perfectly still. At noon, I had a conversation with Boyd and Ray about what it would mean for this club if this doesn't get clarified quickly. And? Garrett looked at him. The amber light from the back bar illuminated the lines in his face. The weight of them, the depth, years compressed into topography. They want you to take a step back, Cade. Formally, publicly. A statement through the club's attorney saying your presence at the hospital was a misunderstanding and that the Iron Saints fully cooperate with law enforcement. The silence in the room was absolute. Walk away, Cade said. Not a question. Protect the club, Garrett said. That's what they said. And what do you say? Garrett was quiet for a long moment. He looked at his glass. He looked at the printout. He looked at the space above the bar where Marcus's photograph had hung for the past 9 months. Marcus, who had died in October, who Cade had stood behind at the graveside thinking about tire pressure and hating himself for it. I say, Garrett said slowly, that I've been doing this long enough to know that the people who want you to walk away from something are very often the people who benefit from you walking away. He looked at Cade directly. But I also say that I cannot make this decision for you, and I cannot protect the club from the consequences of what you're already in the middle of. Whatever comes next, it's yours. You carry it. I know. And if it goes bad, I know, Garrett. They sat with that for a moment. Then Garrett picked up his glass and finished what was in it and set it down with a soft, final sound. The documents you had this morning, he said. Are they safe? Cade looked at him. Yes. Garrett nodded once. Then work faster. The news cycle moved like it always moves, quickly and without interest in nuance. By evening, 2 other outlets had picked up the story, each adding a layer of implication that the original piece had left implicit. By the time Cade's phone lit up with a call from the Iron Saints attorney, Lawrence Bird, the story had accumulated the kind of momentum that didn't require additional facts to sustain itself. It had a shape now. Biker. Child. Suspicious behavior. The shape was self-confirming. Bird was measured and unhappy in equal parts. He explained the club's exposure. He explained the reputational calculus. He explained with the patience of a man who had explained difficult things to difficult people for 30 years that the optimal legal position was distance and silence. Cade listened to all of it. What would you do? He said when Bird finished. A pause. I do exactly what you're going to do, Bird said. Which is ignore everything I just told you, which is why I'd like you to keep me informed of every step so that when this goes sideways, and something like this always goes sideways before it goes right, I can at least limit the structural damage. Another pause. And Cade, don't talk to the media, don't confirm, don't deny. Say nothing and say it consistently. Understood. One more thing. Bird's voice shifted, losing some of its professional evenness. Something personal came through the gap. I have 2 daughters, 8 and 11. So, he cleared his throat. Work fast. Cade set the phone down. The room around him was quiet. His kitchen table was covered in notes and printouts, in the timeline he'd been building for 2 days. The LLC names, the property addresses, the payment flows, the gala date now circled in red ink because it had moved, and 11 days was not the same as 3 weeks. 11 days was almost nothing. 11 days was a door closing. Voss texted him at 10 p.m. 4 words. Documents received. Starting tonight. And then, 3 minutes later, Harrow gave an interview. He watched the video on his laptop. Vincent Harrow in a well-lit room, a backdrop of awards and framed photographs behind him, that professionally trustworthy face arranged in an expression of measured sadness. The interviewer asked about the news reports. Harrow spoke about the Foundation's mission, its years of service, the children it had helped. He expressed concern, deep concern, about what he described as an individual with a pattern of boundary violations who had fixated on a vulnerable child in a way that the Foundation's own case managers had flagged. Case managers. The Foundation had put their own case managers' names on record about Cade Mercer, which meant they'd had time to manufacture a paper trail, which meant they'd known this was coming before he had. He stood up from the table. He walked to the window. The street outside was quiet, cold, a single street lamp dropping a circle of orange light on the empty sidewalk. The temperature had dropped again. Somewhere a few blocks away, he could hear a dog barking at something it didn't understand. His phone rang. Number he didn't recognize, different from the first unknown caller. He answered. "Mr. Mercer." A woman's voice, brisk, slightly breathless, like she'd been moving while she decided to call. "My name is Elena Cross, child advocate, the one who hadn't returned his call 4 days ago." "Ms. Cross?" "I've been reviewing Lucy's session notes from the past 48 hours, she said without preamble. "And I need to tell you something that is not standard practice for me to share with a person of interest in an ongoing investigation, which tells you something about where I've landed on this." A beat. "Lucy has given us 3 names. Not people names, place names. Things she calls them. She calls one of them the Cold House, one of them the Loud House, and one of them the Blue Door." He waited. "We've been cross-referencing those descriptors with everything in the system," Elena continued. "Nothing matches, which means they're not in the system." A pause that felt deliberate. "But there is one match in a database that isn't exactly official. A volunteer network. People who document abandoned properties, derelict buildings, rural structures for historical preservation purposes. An amateur thing. Not law enforcement, not CPS, not any official body." Another pause. "One of your club members contributes to it, a man named Dennis Bishop. He's been documenting vacant structures in a 4-county area for 9 years. Something moved through Cade's chest that wasn't quite anything with a clean name. "I need to talk to Denny," he said. "I know," Elena said. "And I need you to understand that when you do, if he has location data that matches any of Lucy's descriptions, that information needs to come to me and to Detective Voss simultaneously through a channel that doesn't touch the county tip line or the sheriff's general intake." Her voice tightened slightly. "Because Lucy told us something else tonight." He waited again. "She said the people at the Blue Door knew when anyone was coming," Elena said. "She said they always knew. She said once, a man in a uniform came to help, and she thought it was finally over. And then the man in the uniform went inside and talked to the other men, and then he left, and then the children were moved the same night." Elena's voice was very controlled, and underneath the control was something that sounded like it had been controlled for a very long time. She's 6 years old, and she already knows that a uniform isn't the same thing as safe. She already knows that. The room, the quiet, the street lamp outside throwing that orange circle on the empty sidewalk. "I'll call Denny tonight," Cade said. "Mr. Mercer." Elena paused. "Lucy asked about you again this evening, during her session. She asked if the man with the motorcycle was going to get in trouble because of her. He didn't say anything." "I told her no," Elena said. "I'd like to keep that true." She ended the call. He stood at the window for another moment. Then he picked up his keys and his jacket and walked to the door and stopped with his hand on the handle and thought about everything in motion around him. The documents with Voss, the Foundation's counter-narrative, the club's fraying patience, the 11-day window, the unknown deputy who'd received that tip, the case managers whose reports had been manufactured, Harrow's calm face in that well-lit interview room, and somewhere in a temporary foster placement in a county whose institutional walls had already been compromised. A 6-year-old girl worrying about whether a biker she'd known for 40 minutes was going to get in trouble because of her. He walked to his bike, started the engine. The Harley came alive under him, low and steady, and deeply unconcerned with the opinion of anyone who had never ridden one. He sat there for a moment, not moving, just letting it run. In the morning, Garrett would call him in. Boyd and Ray would be there. The attorney's advice would be on the table. The sponsorship withdrawals and the political distancing and the news cycle's manufactured shape would all be laid out as evidence that the rational move was to stand down. And some part of that argument would be correct, and some part of Cade would feel the pull of it, the relief of it, the specific exhaustion of a man who had been fighting things since he was 22 years old and sometimes just wanted to stop. But he already knew what he was going to do. He already knew when he'd seen her behind that vending machine, no coat, no shoes,
12 degrees and falling, asking a stranger if he was going to kill her with the flat affect of a child who'd needed to ask that question before. He pulled out his phone, dialed Denny.
Denny answered on the second ring, which meant he'd been awake. "The preservation database," Cade said. "I need you to run 3 descriptions for me. Right now." A pause. Then, "Give them to me." "Cold house, loud house, blue door." He heard Denny breathing, heard the sound of keyboard strokes. Denny's ancient desktop, the mechanical kind, the one that sounded like a machine that meant business, heard the specific silence of a man reading results on a screen. Then Denny said, "Cade." "Yeah." "I've got something." His voice was different. Something had shifted in it that Cade recognized. The particular quality of a man who has just seen the specific size and shape of the thing they're dealing with and understands for the first time how large it actually is. "I've got all 3. The night held perfectly still around Cade Mercer. "Send me the locations," he said. And Denny, "Yeah. Don't send them to anyone else. Don't call anyone else. Not yet." He paused. "I need to make one call first." "To who?" Cade looked at the orange circle of the street lamp, at the empty sidewalk, at the darkness beyond both. "To the one person who told me to work faster," he said, "because 11 days is almost nothing, and if the locations I think Denny just found are still active—" He stopped. Let the thing he was about to say land fully before he said it. "Then there are children in those buildings right now, tonight, on a night when it's 14 degrees and falling, and the only people who can move without being seen coming are sitting inside a clubhouse that just got told to walk away." He heard Denny go very quiet on the other end. Then he heard something else, the sound of a chair scraping back, boots on a floor, the particular sound of a man who had made a decision he'd already made. "I'll get the others," Denny said. And before Cade could answer, before he could tell him to wait, to hold, that they needed to be careful about how this moved, he heard Denny's phone shift, heard him start to say something to someone else in the room, and then heard a voice in the background that stopped him cold. A voice he recognized. Garrett's voice. Which meant Garrett was at Denny's house. Which meant the club's president had driven to the historian's house tonight, at this hour, in the cold, not to talk the man out of anything, but because he'd understood before Cade called that this was where the night was going, and he'd positioned himself at the place where the decision would be made. And he was already there when the call came in. The engine rumbled beneath him, the cold pressed down from above. Cade realized, in the stillness of that moment, that Garrett had never told him to walk away because Garrett wanted him to walk away. Garrett had told him to walk away because Garrett needed to know, before everything came apart, whether Cade was the kind of man who would. And now he knew. "Tell Garrett," Cade said quietly, "that I'm calling Voss." Denny relayed it. A pause. Then Denny's voice came back. "He says call fast. He says we ride at first light if the locations check out." Cade ended the call, sat on the idling bike in the cold dark, opened his contacts to Naomi Voss's number. He stopped. He looked up. Across the street, parked in the shadow between 2 street lamps, was a dark sedan he hadn't noticed when he came out. Engine off, lights off. But the exhaust pipe was putting out a thin curl of vapor in the cold air. Someone was sitting in that car. Someone who had been sitting in that car, engine running, for long enough to have watched him come outside and make 2 phone calls. His thumb hovered over Voss's number. The sedan's headlights came on. Not moving, just lights on, illuminating the empty street between them. A statement rather than a movement. "I see you. I've been watching. I know what you just did." And then the window came down, slowly, deliberately. And in the gap between the dark interior and the cold night air, Cade saw a hand, holding a phone, pointed at him, photographing him. The window went back up. The sedan pulled out slowly, turned right at the end of the block, and was gone. Cade sat on the Harley with the engine running and looked at the empty street and understood, with the bone-deep clarity of a man who had walked into ambushes before and survived them by understanding too late and learning from the cost, that Vincent Harrow hadn't just fired the first shot in a media campaign. He had given someone the address of Cade's house, and that someone had been here long enough to know exactly who Cade had called. He dialed Voss. She answered in one ring. "I've got locations," he said. "3 of them, and I may have a problem." "What problem?" "I've been watched tonight," he said. "From outside my house. Someone just photographed me and drove away." A silence that lasted 2 seconds and contained an entire recalibration. "How long were they there?" "Long enough," he said. And then, because he needed her to understand the full weight of the next thing he was going to say, "Naomi, if they know I have the locations, they'll move the children," she said, and her voice had gone to a place so controlled it had passed through calm and come out the other side into something colder and harder and absolutely focused. "Tonight, they'll move them tonight." The orange circle of street lamp light on empty pavement, 14 degrees and a sky pressing down on everything. "Then we don't have until first light," Cade said. "No," she said. "We don't." The cold came in through everything. The gap under the garage door, the crack in the east wall where the insulation had never been replaced, the specific porousness of a concrete floor that had absorbed 30 years of winters and never fully warmed up again. The Iron Saints secondary garage on Pritchard Road was not the clubhouse. It had no bar, no memorabilia, no accumulated warmth of gathered men. It was a working space, lifts, tool chests, the smell of grease and solvent and metal that had been heated and cooled so many times it had developed its own particular signature. They used it for bike work and overflow storage, and occasionally for conversations that didn't need witnesses. Tonight it had 7 men in it, and the kind of silence that precedes a decision being made collectively without anyone announcing that a decision was being made. Garrett stood at the center. Beside him, Boyd and Denny and Pike and Jonesy, who had arrived in the order of men who had been called by someone they trusted and hadn't asked questions because the hour and the tone had already told them what they needed to know. Cade stood near the east wall with his phone in his hand and Naomi Voss's last text on the screen, confirming locations. "Give me 40 minutes. Do not move without my call." 40 minutes. The sedan that had photographed him was gone. The street outside was empty, but the fact of the photograph remained, sitting in the room with them like a thing with mass. "Run it again," Garrett said. "Not to anyone specific. To the room." Denny cleared his throat. He'd printed the database entries, 3 pages, property photographs, GPS coordinates, structural notes from his volunteer documentation work. His handwriting was in the margins. His handwriting, over data he'd compiled over 9 years, entirely unaware that any of it meant anything beyond historical record. "Cold house," Denny said, looking at the first page. His voice had the quality of a man who was having difficulty with something and containing it through the effort of being precise. "Former dairy processing facility, Rural Route 7, 12 miles north of Kessler Crossing. I documented it in 2019. Main structure intact, secondary outbuilding with a walk-in cold storage unit, unheated." He paused on that word. Unheated. Nobody said anything. "Loud house, decommissioned grain elevator complex, State Road 44 east of the river, sheet metal exterior. In wind, the panels rattle continuously. Loud." Another pause. "Blue door. Former hunting lodge, private land off the marked trail network near Alden Moor. The main entrance has a blue painted door. Original owner's affectation. Been vacant, I thought, since 2017. I thought. The 2 words that were doing the most work in this room right now. "The LLC records Webb gave us," Cade said. He pulled up the photo he'd taken of the relevant page before handing the envelope to Gia. "Galloway Properties. One of the subsidiary LLCs under Galloway is listed as Aldenmore Land Holdings." He looked at Denny. "That's the hunting lodge." Denny's jaw moved. He looked at the printout in his hand. He looked at his own handwriting in the margins. Careful, meticulous, the notes of a man who had driven out to these places on weekends with a camera and a notebook because he cared about the physical history of a county that was forgetting its own structures. He had documented the blue door. He had posted it in a database. And somewhere between that database and tonight, someone had accessed that information and used it. "Who has access to the preservation network?" Boyd asked. His voice was very controlled. "Anyone," Denny said quietly. "It's public. That's the whole point. Public documentation, public access, so the information doesn't get lost." He set the papers down on a workbench very carefully,
The way you set something down when your hands are not entirely steady. I built a tool to help people find forgotten places. Denny, Garrett's voice. I know. Denny looked at the wall. I know what I'm saying. The room held that for a moment. Cade's phone buzzed. Voss. Galloway Properties. Alden Moore Land Holdings lease active. Renewed 60 days ago. Kessler Crossing property. Galloway subsidiary. Northern Cold Storage LLC. Lease active. Renewed same date. East River property. Galloway subsidiary. Ridgeline Grain Assets LLC. Lease active. All three renewed same day, 60 days ago. That's not coincidence. That's preparation. He read it aloud. The room got quieter, which shouldn't have been possible given how quiet it already was, but it managed it. Then Voss sent a second text, and this one he read to himself first, twice, before he said it out loud, because the first time through he wasn't sure he'd parsed it correctly. He had. Voss ran the Galloway Properties registration, he said. Parent company, not the subsidiaries. The parent. He looked up. The registered agent for Galloway Properties LLC is a law firm, Bird, Kellner, and Associates. The silence after that had a different quality than the silence before. This one had edges. Boyd said very carefully, Bird. Lawrence Bird, Cade said. Yes. The men in the room looked at each other with the specific contained expression of people who are processing a betrayal inside a framework where betrayal is understood to be among the worst things a man can do, and who are therefore being careful not to respond until they are certain they have understood correctly. Because the alternative, responding to something of this magnitude and being wrong, is not something any of them can afford. Garrett looked at Cade. He's been the club's attorney for 14 years. I know. You talked to him yesterday. You told him. I told him I was pursuing the investigation. I did not tell him about the documents or the source. Cade's voice stayed level. The effort required to keep it level was considerable. But I told him enough. And he called Harrow. He paused. Or someone at the firm did. Or Bird is the registered agent and doesn't know the full scope of what Galloway is. I don't know yet which of those is true. Which one matters? Boyd asked. All of them, Garrett said quietly. All of them matter, and none of them matter right now, because right now we have 3 locations that may be active, and we have 40 minutes that have become... He looked at Cade. 32, Cade said. 32 minutes before Voss calls back with whatever law enforcement she can assemble through channels she trusts, which may not be enough channels, which may not assemble fast enough. Garrett's hands were flat on the workbench surface. Still. And if the people who had that sedan outside your house tonight understand what you found, Cade, if Bird called someone after your conversation yesterday, then they've had since last night to prepare, Cade said. The fluorescent lights in the garage hummed. Outside, wind moved across the lot, a thin mineral sound, the kind that cuts rather than pushes. Pike spoke for the first time. He was 38, quiet by nature, had done 2 years in the Army before a back injury separated him, and had the habit of waiting until a room had emptied itself of noise before contributing to it. How many kids are we talking about? Cade looked at him. Don't know. Lucy said the other kids. Plural. Webb's record showed high-capacity properties. The hunting lodge alone has 6 sleeping rooms. Pike nodded once, slowly. And then he walked to the corner of the garage where the gear lockers were and started doing something with his hands that didn't require further discussion from him about whether he was participating. Jonesy followed. Then Boyd. Garrett looked at Cade. I need to call Voss, Cade said. Before anything else moves. Make the call. He stepped outside. The cold arrived immediately and completely, the way cold does at 2 a.m. when the temperature has been dropping for hours, and there's no longer any pretense of moderation. His breath came out in a white plume. He dialed. Voss answered before the first ring completed. We have a problem. I have one too. Bird. I know about Bird. That's my problem. Her voice was tight in a way he hadn't heard before. The controlled tightness of someone managing fear by converting it into forward movement.
The law firm's connection flags a conflict across the county legal system. Bird has represented 3 different county entities over the past decade. Do you understand what that means for which judge I can approach for an emergency warrant tonight? How many can you actually use? A pause. 1? Maybe. That's not enough for 3 locations. No, it's not. He heard her moving, footsteps, a door, the muffled sound of wind on her end too. Elena Cross has a contact at the state AG's office. She's been on the phone with him for the past 20 minutes, but state-level intervention takes time we may not have. She paused. Cade, tell me honestly, how confident are you in these locations? He thought about Lucy's voice, the flat, specific way she'd named places like she was naming rooms in a house she'd lived in, not describing, naming. The specificity of someone who had been there long enough to give it a name rather than just a fear. Completely, he said. Another pause. Then I need you to understand something. Officially, I cannot direct or sanction any action at those locations that doesn't proceed through proper legal channels. Officially. I understand officially. Unofficially, she said, and her voice went somewhere very careful and very deliberate. I need someone at each of those locations doing nothing more than passive observation, documentation only, eyes on, so that if movement begins, if vehicles arrive, if lights go on, if anything changes, I have real-time intelligence that justifies emergency intervention without a warrant. A pause that lasted exactly as long as it needed to. That's all I need, observation. Understood? 3 locations, she said. You have how many people? 7. Including me. Split them. 2 on each outer location, 3 on the hunting lodge. That's the highest capacity property. That's the one most likely to be primary. Her voice was fast and flat and utterly focused. Nobody goes inside. Nobody engages. If contact is initiated from the other side, you call me immediately and you do not escalate. Clear? Clear. And Cade. She stopped, started again. If there are children inside those buildings tonight, and if something starts moving before I can get there with people I trust, you use your judgment. That's all I can say. Use your judgment. She ended the call. He stood in the cold for a moment with the dead phone in his hand and the wind against his face and thought about the specific weight of that sentence. Use your judgment. Said by a detective who had worked inside a system she was now watching fail in real time, to a man she'd put on a list of people she trusted for a reason she hadn't fully explained yet. It was an authorization and a deniability and a transfer of moral weight and a vote of confidence all at once, and it landed on him with the full density of all 4. He went back inside. He told them. All of it, including Voss's last instruction, word for word. The room listened. When he finished, Garrett looked around at the men. At Boyd checking the charge on his flashlight, at Pike, who had already pulled on an extra layer, at Denny, who was standing very still with his arms crossed and his eyes on the floor, still carrying the weight of those database entries and what they'd been used for. Observation, Garrett said. That's what we're doing. That's what we're doing, Kate agreed. Garrett held his gaze for one more second. Then, Denny, Cold House and Loud House. You take Jonesy and Ray. Keep your phones on, and don't let me hear your engines until you're a half mile out. He looked at Boyd. Boyd, Pike. Alden Moore with Cade and me. You're coming? Cade said. You're going to tell me not to. He wasn't. He didn't. They rode without headlights for the last quarter mile to the hunting lodge. The Harleys throttled down to a crawl that was almost painful, the engine's low rumble swallowed by the wind moving through the tree line. The track that led off the main road wasn't marked. It was the kind of road that required knowing it was there, which was why Denny's documentation notes had been specific about the turnoff. Third track past the mile marker, unpaved, follows the tree line for approximately 400 meters before opening into a clearing. The clearing appeared through the trees and Garrett touched Cade's arm, and they both stopped, killing the engines, letting the silence reassemble itself around them. The lodge was dark. 2 stories, timber frame, the blue door barely visible in the ambient light that came from a single exterior fixture on the near corner, a utility light on a timer or a sensor, the kind that stayed on all night.
No vehicles visible in the clearing, no movement, but there were tire tracks in the frost, recent ones, multiple sets. Boyd was beside him, close enough that Cade could hear his breathing, measured, controlled, the breathing of a man managing his own adrenaline through respiratory discipline. Pike had gone wide left, circling through the tree line to establish a sightline on the structure's rear. They waited. 11 minutes. Wind in the trees, the utility light, the tracks in the frost. Then Pike's voice came through in a text, no call. They'd agreed on text only unless something required immediate voice. Rear of structure, generator, running, covered with tarp but heat exhaust visible. Cade showed Garrett the screen. Garrett's jaw tightened. A generator. Running at 2:30 in the morning. In a building that was supposed to be vacant. Cade texted Voss. Aldenmore, generator running, recent vehicle tracks, dark exterior, need your timeline. Her reply took 4 minutes that felt like 20. Judge signed, state AG contact pushing federal angle. ETA for team I trust, 50 minutes minimum. Can you hold? He looked at the lodge. He looked at the tracks. He thought about what Vincent Harrow's people had seen when they photographed him outside his house. He thought about the 60-day lease renewal, about the gala moved forward, about the sedan driving away after the photograph, going somewhere, telling someone something. He texted back. Holding. They held. At the 30-minute mark, Denny texted from the cold house. Nothing. Structure dark, no activity, no vehicle tracks. Jonesy confirmed from the loud house 5 minutes later. Quiet. Old tracks, but nothing recent. All the activity was here, at Aldenmore, at the Blue Door. Cade was trying to decide what that meant, whether it meant concentration, everything in one place, or whether it meant the other two locations had already been cleared and this was the final position. When Pike sent another text. Then the text stopped mid-word. Movement inside second floor when... Silence. Then, light. Flashlight moving room to room. Cade's hand was on Garrett's arm before he'd consciously decided to reach for it. He showed him the phone. Garrett read it. His expression did not change in any dramatic way. It just settled into something that had no give in it whatsoever. Cade texted Voss. Interior movement. Flashlight activity, second floor. Someone inside. Her response was immediate. Do not engage. I'm calling the team now. 35 minutes. 35 minutes. He looked at the lodge. Calculated square footage mentally, the way he'd been trained to calculate. Room size, number of occupants, exit points, structural choke points. A 2-story hunting lodge with 6 sleeping rooms and a generator running and a flashlight moving room to room at 2:45 in the morning. Someone was inside doing something. The question was what? Boyd shifted beside him. A small movement, barely perceptible, but Cade had known Boyd for 9 years and the shift meant something. He looked at him. Boyd tilted his chin toward the Blue Door. His eyes asked a question his mouth wasn't asking because they'd agreed to hold. Cade shook his head. Not yet. Boyd's jaw moved. He looked back at the lodge. Held. Then, not from the lodge, from the access road, from behind them, headlights. A vehicle coming in. Fast. No hesitation on the turnoff, which meant someone who knew exactly where it was. They moved simultaneously into the tree line without communicating it, a coordinated instinct, the kind that comes from years of riding together and reading each other's bodies. The vehicle came into the clearing, a dark SUV moving quickly, and it stopped 30 feet from the lodge's entrance, and 2 men got out, and one of them went directly to the Blue Door without knocking and opened it with a key and went inside. The second man stayed outside. He stood near the vehicle with his hands in his pockets and his face turned slightly away from the utility light, which told Cade he was aware of the light, which told Cade he was aware of sightlines, which told Cade something about his training. He was looking at his phone, reading something. Then he made a call, short, 10 seconds. And put the phone away. Cade's phone buzzed. Voss, change of timeline, I've got a problem. Tell me what you're seeing right now. He described it in real time, texting one-handed, watching the man by the SUV with his other eye. Voss was typing between his messages, responses coming back fragmented and fast. Second man outside. What's his build?
Can you see the SUV plates? Partial is fine. He gave her what he could from the distance. She went quiet for 90 seconds that felt geological. Then, the SUV is registered to Donahue County Sheriff's Department, fleet vehicle, off the standard rotation log. He stared at that for a moment. A county sheriff's fleet vehicle, off the rotation log, at the hunting lodge at 2:45 in the morning, which means, he was already calculating, whoever is inside that lodge right now came in a vehicle that will appear, on paper, to have been somewhere else tonight. He texted, "Who has access to the fleet vehicles off rotation?" Her response came back in pieces, like she was checking databases while she typed, "Senior officers, department heads." And then a pause that was too long for a text delay, and civilian staff with fleet management authorization, which includes another pause. Cade, Del Rourke's wife, works fleet management for the county. Del Rourke, the duty sergeant who had received the tip about Cade at the hospital. The name Voss had said she'd spent 6 weeks trying to find a reason to trust. She hadn't found one. He showed Garrett the phone. Garrett read it. Then he looked at Cade, and in the low light of the tree line at 2:45 in the morning, with a generator humming inside an occupied building in front of them, his face expressed something that Cade had only seen on it once before. At Marcus's graveside in October, when Garrett had looked at the coffin and briefly, privately, appeared to understand exactly what it meant to lose something you'd believed in. "He has our attorney," Garrett said quietly. "He has access to the fleet, and he received the tip about you." He paused. "Rourke isn't just compromised, he's part of it." "He may have been part of it before the tip came in," Cade said. "The tip may have been his idea." The man by the SUV shifted position, turned slightly. His face caught the utility light for a moment. Cade went absolutely still. He knew that face. Not well. Distantly. The specific distance of a face seen in a photograph, a formal photograph, the kind taken at an annual event where people stood in rows and smiled for a camera. He had looked at that photograph recently. In the past several days, in the course of reading everything he'd been able to find about Sunrise Promise Foundation. The man by the SUV was in the 2022 banquet photograph, third from the left in the back row. He'd been identified in the caption as a foundation board member. His name, according to that caption, was Thomas Rourke, Del Rourke's brother. He texted Voss the name. She came back in 40 seconds. Thomas Rourke. Board member, Sunrise Promise since 2020. Prior to that, 5 years in county planning and zoning. He approved the Aldenmore property reclassification that allowed the hunting lodge to remain off the residential registry. A pause. Cade. The whole thing runs through one family. Del provides law enforcement cover. Thomas provides regulatory cover. Bird provides legal cover. And Harrow provides the public face. Another pause. This has been here for years, right under... The blue door opened. The man who'd gone inside came back out. He was carrying something. He stopped by the SUV and set it down. A bag, a duffel, something, and opened the vehicle's rear hatch and slid it inside. Then he went back in. Then he came back out with another one. They were packing. Cade's phone buzzed. Voss. They're moving the children. I'm 25 minutes out with 2 people I trust and a federal contact on the phone. But Cade, if they get those kids into vehicles and onto the highway... She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. He looked at Garrett. Garrett looked at him. Observation, Cade said. That's what we were doing, Garrett said. Neither of them was talking about what they were doing now. Boyd, Cade said quietly, here. If that vehicle moves before Voss arrives, it does not leave this property. Boyd was quiet for exactly 1 second. How? Block the access road. The track is single lane. 1 bike sideways across it stops any vehicle. He paused. Don't touch anyone. Don't initiate contact. You're a biker who had engine trouble on a rural road at 3 in the morning. You don't know anything about anything. Boyd looked at him. And if they decide not to wait for an explanation? Then you call my number and you leave the phone open and you make as much noise as possible. Boyd considered this. Then he nodded once and slipped back through the tree line toward where the bikes were parked. Thomas Rourke was on his phone again by the SUV. This call was longer. He turned away from the lodge, facing the tree line, facing the direction Cade was in, which was uncomfortable enough that Cade slowed his breathing deliberately and felt Garrett do the same beside him. Then the blue door opened a third time, and this time the man who'd been inside did not come out with bags. He came out with a child. Small. Wrapped in what appeared to be a blanket, carried in the man's arms, not walking, not visibly struggling, head against the man's shoulder. The blanket was too big, dragging, and the child's bare feet extended below it and caught the utility light for a moment, pale, small, motionless. Cade's ribcage did something that had nothing to do with adrenaline and everything to do with 11 years as a combat medic who had carried things he hadn't been able to save. The man carried the child to the SUV's rear seat, opened it, placed the child inside with a careful, practiced efficiency that was somehow worse than roughness would have been. Worse because it was professional, routine, the movement of someone who had done this before and developed a technique for it. He went back inside. Garrett's hand was on Cade's arm. Holding, not pulling, holding, the specific grip of a man who understood exactly what he was restraining and why it needed to be restrained for exactly as long as it needed to be, and not 1 second longer. Cade texted Voss. They have at least one child in the vehicle, moving now. How far? 18 minutes. Federal agent is calling in additional units, but rural response time. They'll be gone in 10. A pause that lasted 3 seconds. Cade. I know. He looked at the lodge. He looked at Garrett's hand on his arm. He looked at the SUV with its rear door closed and the shape of a small body visible through the window in the utility light. Garrett released his arm. Go, Garrett said. Just that. What happened next took 4 minutes and 30 seconds, and Cade experienced it the way he'd experienced acute situations in the field. Not in real time, but in a kind of hyper-detailed suspension, each second containing more sensory information than a second should reasonably hold. He came out of the tree line at a walk. Not a run. A walk. Deliberate, because running toward a trained man who is potentially armed produces a specific response that a walk does not, and the difference between those two responses was something he needed to control for. Thomas Rourke turned. He was fast, faster than his build suggested, the fast of someone who had trained for exactly this contingency and was now deciding in real time whether what he was seeing was a threat. His hand moved toward his jacket. Don't, Cade said. His voice came out at a volume calibrated to carry exactly as far as the distance between them and no farther. Controlled, level. The voice of a man who had used it under fire and knew what it did to people when it had a certain quality in it. Rourke's hand stopped. He was processing. There is a federal agent 20 minutes out, Cade said. There is a state AG representative on the phone with law enforcement right now. There are 3 other law enforcement personnel I am in real-time contact with who know this location, this vehicle's registration, and your name. He stopped. He was close enough now to see Rourke's face clearly, the calculation running through it, the assessment of odds. The child in the back seat, is she the only one inside? Rourke said nothing. How many are inside? Cade's voice didn't change quality. Same calibration, same control, same deliberate flatness that contained the thing underneath it through sheer structural discipline. I need a number. You have no idea what you've walked into, Rourke said. His voice was almost conversational. That was frightening in a specific way. I have a very good idea. No. Rourke shook his head slowly. He wasn't afraid. That was the thing that settled into Cade's awareness with the weight of a structural observation rather than an emotional one. Rourke was not afraid. He was recalculating, but he was not afraid. You found a loose end. Lucy was a mistake. She wasn't supposed to be there. She slipped the transit. There was a gap in the process. You happened to be at the right location. He looked at Cade steadily. But you found one thread. You don't know the rope. Tell me about the rope. Something moved across Rourke's face. Amusement, almost. The specific amusement of a man who has decided that the person in front of him is not in a position to use what they're being told. It goes further than your detective friend can reach, he said.
further than a state AG and further than whatever federal contact she called tonight. Bird has been covering paper for this network across 4 states for 8 years. You think you found a children's charity with a dirty director? He paused. You found one window in a building you can't see the outside of. 4 states. The number landed and changed everything around it. Not a county operation, not a regional one. 4 states meant a network of a scale and a depth and an institutional penetration that was, he ran the calculation and ran it again, and the answer kept coming out the same way. That was not going to be dismantled by 3 biker club members, a detective with limited cleared contacts, and a federal agent on a phone call. How many children in that building? Cade said. He kept his voice level. Rourke looked at him for a long moment. Something shifted in his face. Not conscience, not guilt, something more functional than either. The look of a man who has decided that truth, in this specific moment, is a kind of power move rather than a concession. 4, he said, plus the one in the vehicle. 5. And the loud house? The cold house? Empty. Have been for weeks. Rourke's eyes were steady. We consolidated, in anticipation. A pause. The gala doesn't reset things the way you think it does. The gala is a social function. The actual reset happened 60 days ago, when the leases renewed and the new transit routes were established. He tilted his head slightly. You're 2 months behind where you think you are. The man who had been inside the lodge came through the blue door and stopped dead when he saw Cade standing 10 feet from Rourke. His hand went to his jacket immediately. Don't, Rourke said to him. The same word Cade had used, different context. Not restraint, but tactical patience. The man's hand dropped. His eyes moved between Cade and Rourke with the controlled alertness of someone waiting for instruction. Cade? Garrett's voice from the tree line, calm. Here, Cade said. Boyd's on the road. 1 entrance, 1 exit. Boyd across the access track. Rourke heard it. He ran the calculation. His eyes went to the tree line, back to Cade, to the second man, back to Cade. Cade watched him arrive at the number. 3 visible, unknown quantity in the trees, access blocked, federal contact inbound, documentation already transmitted, and watched him understand the arithmetic. You said 4 children inside, Cade said. Rourke didn't answer. I'm going inside, Bant, Cade said. I'm not asking. You go through that door, Rourke said, and everything that comes next gets complicated in ways you haven't planned for. Everything that came next got complicated the second I found Lucy behind a vending machine. He held Rourke's gaze, step away from the vehicle. Another calculation. Then Rourke stepped sideways, not away from the vehicle, laterally, a movement that opened the sight line to the blue door while not conceding the vehicle or the second man. A negotiating position. He was still in it, still running options. Garrett came out of the tree line, then Pike from the far left. 3 men visible. The second man by the lodge entrance did a rapid assessment, looked at the tree line for what he couldn't see, and his posture changed. A subtle unwinding of the readiness, a recognition of odds. Cade walked to the blue door. Inside. Dark except for the flashlight that had been left on a windowsill pointing up, improvised lantern, casting a yellowed cone of light into the ceiling and diffusing down into something barely workable. The entry was a mudroom, hooks on the wall, the smell of cold concrete and something else beneath it. The particular smell of inhabited enclosed space, human warmth trapped and stale. He went through the inner door. Main room. Empty. He moved to the stairs. Climbed. The second-floor hallway had 4 doors. He tried the first one. 2 children. Both awake. Sitting upright in the dark, eyes wide, the immediate specific stillness of children who had learned that stillness was safer than movement. A boy and a girl, maybe 7 and 9, wearing mismatched clothes that were too large or too small in ways that said the clothes had come from wherever, whenever. They looked at him. At the leather jacket, the patches, the size of him in the doorframe, and neither of them made a sound. Hey, he said. Same word he'd said to Lucy, same crouch, same hands visible.
The girl said nothing. The boy said very quietly, "Are you with them?" "No." His voice held. "I'm not with them." The boy looked at him with a version of Lucy's calculating eyes. The same system, the same function, the same terrible early developed assessment protocol. Running the calculation on whether the man in the doorway was another version of every other man who had come through a doorway. "There's a woman coming," Cade said. "A detective. She's 20 minutes away. I need you to stay in this room until she gets here. Can you do that?" The girl reached out and held the boy's arm, not seeking comfort, giving it. An automatic practice gesture between the two of them that said they had been doing this, holding each other together in the dark, for longer than he wanted to think about. "Okay," the boy said. He checked the second room. One child, asleep or something close to it, lying on a cot with a blanket pulled up, not moving, breathing audible. Young, 6 or 7, face turned away. He did not wake her. Third room. One child, awake, in the corner. Older, 11 or 12, the age where the calculation in the eyes had developed additional layers, where there was anger underneath the fear, rather than just fear. He met Cade's eyes and did not look away. "How many of you are there?" this one asked. "Enough," Cade said. Something in the boy's face shifted. Not trust, not yet, probably not for a long time, but something that was in the direction of trust, that recognized the word as meaning something real. Fourth room. Empty. He went back downstairs, out through the blue door, into the cold that hit him like a physical weight after the trapped warmth of the interior. Garrett was standing near the SUV. Rourke and the second man were against the vehicle's side. Not restrained, not touched, because nobody had touched them, but contained by the geometry of 4 bikers positioned at angles that left them with no comfortable direction to move in. Rourke was on his phone. Garrett had let him make the call. Cade saw the calculation in that. The acknowledgement that stopping the call created one kind of problem while allowing it created a different one, and Garrett had chosen the problem they could better manage. 4 inside, Cade said to Garrett. 1 in the vehicle. All alive. Something moved through Garrett's face. He contained it the same way he contained everything, through the specific discipline of a man who had decided decades ago that feelings were real and legitimate and timed for later. Cade texted Voss. 5 children, 4 in structure, 1 in vehicle, all confirmed alive. 2 adult males on scene, not restrained, not engaged, access road blocked. Need you here. Her response? 12 minutes. Federal agent has county sheriff's office on notice. Not Rourke, the sheriff directly. Do not let anyone leave. He looked at Rourke. Rourke looked back. The call was done, phone back in his pocket. He stood against the SUV with a specific quality of stillness that Cade recognized. The stillness of a man who had made one more calculation and arrived at waiting as his current best option. Not concession. Strategy. You said 4 states, Cade said. Rourke didn't answer. How long? Still nothing. The charity's been operating for 14 years. Webb's records go back 8. Cade looked at him steadily. How long before Harrow? Rourke's expression shifted by a degree. Not surprise. Recognition. The recognition of someone who hadn't expected that specific question. You're asking the wrong question, he said. What's the right question? Rourke looked at the lodge, at the blue door, at the tree line, then at Cade, and in the utility light at 3:15 in the morning, with the cold coming down on everything, Cade saw something in his face that he hadn't seen before. Not guilt, not remorse, something more complicated and less clean than either. The look of a man who knew the size of the thing and understood that what was happening tonight, what Cade had done, was not the end of it. The right question, Rourke said, is who was Bird working for before he started covering for Harrow? The utility light hummed, the generator hummed behind it. Somewhere in the tree line, wind moved through the upper branches with a sound like intake breath. Because Harrow, Rourke said, and his voice had gone to a place that was almost something like exhaustion. Didn't build this. Harrow was recruited into something that was already running. He looked at Cade. You collapsed 1 node tonight. Congratulations. There are others. And the people who run those others know who you are, and they know what you did tonight, and they know you're the man who found Lucy." He paused. "And Lucy knows things she hasn't told your detective friend yet. Things she doesn't know she knows. Things that, if she remembers them and if she tells them to the right people in the right order, could reach places you can't protect her from. The night, the cold, the blue door behind him and the 4 children inside it, and the one in the vehicle, and Lucy somewhere in a temporary foster placement in a county whose institutional walls had holes Cade still couldn't fully map. "What does she know?" he said. "She was at the consolidation," Rourke said, 6 weeks ago, when they moved everything through the Meridian Street property, the last time it was used before it went fully dark. She saw a face there, an adult face that she will recognize when she sees it again. And she will see it again, because that face is very public and very trusted and completely insulated from anything you've done tonight." He held Cade's gaze. "She doesn't know what she saw, but when she's older, when she's stable, when someone shows her a photograph, she'll know." "Whose face?" Cade said. Rourke closed his mouth. "Whose?" Headlights on the access road. Multiple. The sound of vehicles moving fast and then stopping. Voices. The specific coordinated quality of trained people arriving with purpose. Naomi Voss came through the trees first, flashlight cutting the dark, and behind her 2 people Cade didn't recognize, and one he did. A man in a federal windbreaker moving with the particular controlled urgency of someone who had been on the phone for 45 minutes, making this moment possible. Voss saw the scene and read it in about 3 seconds. The bikers, the SUV, the 2 men against the vehicle, the lodge with its generator hum and blue door, and came directly to Cade. 5, he said before she could ask. "All alive." She closed her eyes for exactly 1 second, opened them. "The structure's clear?" 4 inside. I didn't move them. 1 in the vehicle." She turned and directed her people toward the SUV and the lodge with the efficiency of someone whose entire nervous system had converted to task completion mode. The federal agent was already on his radio. The 2 men against the vehicle were being separated, hands checked, the language of the operation shifting from informal containment to formal procedure. Rourke went with them without resistance. He didn't look at Cade again, but as the federal agent put him against the vehicle and began the formal process, Rourke said one more thing, said it quietly, not quite loud enough to be official, but loud enough for Cade to hear. "Get her somewhere they don't know about," he said. "Whatever safe feels like to you. It's probably not safe enough, because whoever she saw at Meridian Street is going to want to know, before any of this reaches a courtroom, exactly what a 6-year-old girl remembers." Then he was done. He said nothing else. He was processed and separated from the scene with the mechanical efficiency of an operation that had finally, after weeks of institutional failure, found the authority it needed to function. Cade stood in the clearing outside the blue door with Garrett on his left, and the utility light above them, and the sound of children's voices. Thin, uncertain, the voices of children who have been in the dark a long time and are being asked to believe that the people coming through the door with flashlights are different from the people who came through doors before, filtering down from the 2nd floor. He thought about Rourke's face when he'd said who was Bird working for before Harrow, the exhaustion in it. Not regret. Exhaustion. The exhaustion of a man who had been inside a thing large enough to be its own gravity for long enough that getting out of it had stopped being imaginable. He thought about 4 states. He thought about Lucy in a foster placement in a county with compromised walls, knowing something she didn't know she knew, carrying a face in her memory like a photograph she hadn't developed yet. Voss appeared at his shoulder. She looked at the lodge, at the operation in progress, at the federal agent's radio traffic in the cold air, and she said nothing for a moment. Just stood there, taking stock. "You held," she said finally. "We observed," he said. She looked at him sideways, something in her face that was not quite amusement and not quite relief, but lived in the neighborhood of both. "Rourke said something to you at the end." "Yes." "What?" He told her. "The consolidation at Meridian Street 6 weeks ago. The face. The public figure Lucy didn't know she'd seen. Rourke's warning." Voss went very still beside him, the kind of stillness that says a person's mind has just run ahead of their body and is processing at a speed the body can't match. "She needs to be moved," Cade said. "I know." The foster placement. Whoever approved it, whoever knows the address. I know, Cade. Her voice was flat and fast. I know. She turned to him fully. In the utility light, her face was exhausted in a way that had clearly been building for longer than tonight. The specific exhaustion of someone who had been carrying the knowledge that a system they worked inside was rotten in places they hadn't yet fully mapped, and who had been deciding, slowly, which people they could trust to help them find the edges of the rot. I need you to understand something. What happened tonight, the 5 children, the arrests, the federal involvement, that is real, and it matters, and it is not nothing. But Rourke was right about the node. We broke one node. She paused. And the man whose face Lucy saw at Meridian Street, if Rourke's implication is what I think it is, he is not a node. He is not Harrow. He is not Bird. She paused again, longer. He is the reason this has been running for 8 years without anyone finding it. The cold. The generator. The voices from the second floor. Who is he? Cade said. Naomi Voss looked at him, and in her face he saw the specific expression of someone who has arrived at a conclusion they've been approaching for a long time and still aren't ready for it. I don't know yet, she said, but Lucy does. And in that moment, with 5 children being carried and walked toward warmth for the first time in however long it had been, and Rourke in federal custody, and the blue door standing open behind them, and somewhere beyond the tree line the road back to a world where a 6-year-old girl was sleeping in a placement that was no longer safe, Cade Mercer understood that the thing he'd ridden into 11 days before a gala that was now irrelevant had not ended tonight. It had opened. And what was inside it was larger and darker and more deeply embedded than anything his club, his detective, his federal contact, or any institutional wall he could build around a child was going to be enough to hold back alone. He pulled out his phone, looked at the screen, looked at the tree line where Garrett was standing, watching him with the patient steadiness of a man who had said you carry it and meant it, but who had also ridden to Aldenmore at 3 a.m. and positioned himself in those trees and stayed. He thought about what Rourke had said. Get her somewhere they don't know about. He thought about one place no institutional registry, no county system, no compromised database, no LLC subsidiary, no law firm with cross-jurisdictional conflicts, no fleet vehicle off the rotation log, and no public figure with a trusted face had any record of. He looked at Garrett. Garrett looked back. We need to move Lucy, Cade said. Garrett's expression did not change. To where? And Cade told him. The place Cade had in mind was Denny's sister's property, 40 acres of scrub and second-growth timber off a county road that didn't appear on most navigation apps because it predated the digital mapping era and nobody had ever bothered to update the record. The farmhouse at the center of it had been empty for 3 years since Ruth Bishop moved to Tucson for her knees, but Denny still drove out twice a month to check the pipes and run the heat so the structure didn't die in the winters. It had no institutional connection to anyone. It wasn't in any database Cade could think of. It was the kind of place that existed in the gap between what systems know and what people actually do with their lives. He told Voss on the drive back. She listened without interrupting, which by now he'd learned meant she was deciding whether something was workable rather than waiting for a reason to object. CPS will fight you on placement, she said. CPS has a leak. I know. I'm saying they'll fight you anyway because that's what the process does. She had both hands on her wheel and her eyes on the road, and the exhaustion in her face had settled into something that looked almost like resolve, the particular kind that comes after a long night when you've run out of alternatives and what's left is just the thing that has to happen. I need Elena in this conversation before morning. Call her. I am calling her. I'm telling you it's a conversation, not a unilateral decision. Lucy has an advocate, and that advocate has standing, and if we try to move her without Elena's agreement, we create a legal problem that Bird's network, whoever's still standing in it, can use to reverse everything. He hadn't thought about that. He should have. How long to reach her? I have her on the other line right now. Voss glanced at him. You think I've been quiet because I'm relaxed? He rode beside her in silence for a moment. The road was empty at 4 a.m, flat and dark, the tree lines on either side holding whatever they held. Rourke said Bird was working for someone before Harrow, Cade said. I know, you told me. Have you got a name yet? I have a direction, she said. I have a pattern in the financial records that Webb's documents opened up. The transfers don't originate with Harrow. They flow through him, but they originate from a fund that predates the foundation by 3 years. She paused. There is a name attached to that fund. I'm not saying it out loud yet because I said it out loud 2 hours ago to the federal agent on scene, and he went very quiet in a way I didn't like. Which means I don't know yet what the federal agent's quiet means, and until I know, I'm being careful. She said it without drama, just fact, the way someone recites a structural load calculation. This is what it looks like when an investigation gets to a certain altitude. People start going quiet, not because they're corrupt, sometimes just because they're scared, because the altitude is enough to make you scared. They drove. The heater in Voss's vehicle ran a degree or two below adequate, and Cade could feel the cold still in his hands from the clearing. Elena agrees, Voss said, and the shift in her voice was so small that most people would have missed it, a fractional release of something she'd been holding since she made the call. Provisionally. She wants to see the property before Lucy is moved, and she wants to be present for the move itself. She can have both. She also said, Voss stopped. Started again. She said Lucy asked for you again tonight, before any of this happened. During her evening session, Elena asked her if there was anywhere she felt she'd be safe, and she said she didn't know what safe felt like, and Elena asked her to try to describe it anyway. Another pause. She said it felt like being inside a jacket that was too big. That was the whole description. That was everything she had for safe. The road, the dark, the heater that wasn't quite enough. Cade kept his eyes forward. By 6 a.m, 5 children were in county medical receiving the kind of assessment that took hours and produced documentation that nobody would be able to quietly make disappear, because the federal agent had ensured that the documentation was going to 3 separate jurisdictions simultaneously. Whatever Rourke had meant about altitude and insulation, the 5 children from Aldenmore were now in a paper trail that was too wide and too multi-jurisdictional to be quietly managed. By 7, Harrow's attorney had issued a statement describing his client's shock and grief at the misuse of the foundation's structure by individuals who had exploited his trust, characterizing Harrow as a victim of sophisticated fraud rather than its architect. By 7:15, Cade had read the statement on his phone in Denny's kitchen and put the phone face down on the table. Denny poured coffee, set it in front of him, sat down across from him without saying anything for a while. Ruth won't mind, Denny said eventually. About the house. I know. She fostered kids herself back in the 90s. 3 of them, before her back got bad. He wrapped his hands around his own mug. She'd say yes before I finished asking. Cade looked at the table, at the coffee, at his own hands, which were steadier than they had any right to be after the kind of night they'd had. I need to ask you something, he said. Ask? The preservation database. When you documented those properties, did you ever go inside the hunting lodge? Denny was quiet for a moment. Once, he said. 2017. Door was unlocked. I went in to photograph the interior. Structural documentation. He paused. There was nothing there. It was empty. Just the rooms and the old furniture and the blue door that the previous owner painted because he liked blue. I know. Somebody used something I built to hide children in a place I thought I was preserving. His voice stayed level, but something moved underneath the level. I've been sitting with that since 2 o'clock this morning. It's not yours. I know it's not mine in the way you mean it. I know that. He looked at the table. Still have to sit with it. Cade left him with it. Some things required sitting with. At 8:30, Garrett called. Boyd is here, he said. Ray, Pike, Jonesy. All here. The attorney situation needs to be addressed, and I'd like you present for it. Bird. He's been the club's legal representation for 14 years. We need to understand exactly what his connection to Galloway Properties means before we say anything else publicly or legally. A pause. Lawrence called me an hour ago. What did he say? He said he was a registered agent for Galloway Properties on behalf of a client he represented prior to his work with the Iron Saints, and that he was unaware of the full scope of what Galloway was being used for. Garrett's voice gave nothing away. He said he wants the opportunity to explain.
Do you believe him? Silence. The particular silence of Garrett Hale deciding how much honesty the moment required. I believe that what he said is technically possible, he said. I believe it's also exactly what someone would say if they were trying to manage exposure. Another pause. I'd like you in the room when we hear him out. Cade drove to the clubhouse. The morning was gray and cold, and the kind of quiet that happens after a night that spent all its energy, the world wrung out and sitting in the result. The clubhouse smelled the same, oil, wood, the ghost of cigarettes, but it felt different now. The way a room feels different after a significant conversation has happened in it, even if the furniture hasn't moved. Bird was there. He was sitting at the far end of the long table in a dark suit that looked like he'd put it on specifically to have something to put on, something that resembled composure from a distance. Up close, his eyes had the specific quality of a man who hadn't slept and who understood, clearly and completely, that the next hour was going to determine whether he still had the thing he'd spent 30 years building. Boyd was against the wall. Ray and Pike were at the table. Jonesy was near the door. Garrett sat at the head. Cade sat across from Bird. Bird looked at him. I need you to understand the timeline, he said. He said it to Cade rather than Garrett, which was either a mistake or a calculated read of where the actual authority in the room resided at this particular moment. Give it to me, Cade said. I represented a development group 12 years ago. Standard commercial work, LLC formation, property acquisitions, regulatory filings. One of the entities in that group was Galloway Properties. I formed it. I served as the registered agent because that's what I did for all of that client's entities. He had his hands flat on the table in front of him, controlled. The client relationship ended 8 years ago. I assumed the entities had wound down or transferred representation. I had no contact with Galloway after that. None. Who was the client? Cade said. Bird's hand stayed flat. A holding company called Meridian Capital Partners. The table went quiet. Meridian. The same name as the street with the vacant building. Not a coincidence. A signature, the kind of repetition that people fall into when they're building something and they're arrogant enough to believe it won't be traced. Who owns Meridian Capital Partners? Cade said. It was a multi-member LLC. The managing member at the time was a man named Gerald Cross. Bird paused. I found out this morning, when I started pulling records, that Gerald Cross and the current executive director of the Michigan Office of Child and Family Services are the same person. The room processed that. Not a county official, not a charity director, not a law enforcement officer. The executive director of the state agency responsible for overseeing child welfare in Michigan. Boyd pushed off the wall. Just that. A physical repositioning, a body expressing what it wasn't saying. Garrett's hands came together on the table in front of him, fingers interlaced, the deliberate stillness of a man applying his full available discipline to staying in his chair. Elena Cross, Cade said, and heard his own voice say it and felt what it meant arrive at the same moment. Elena Cross, child advocate, the woman who had called him, who had given him Lucy's descriptions, who had agreed to the placement at Ruth's farmhouse, who was going to be present for the move, whose last name matched the managing member of the entity that had started all of this. Her father, Bird said. I don't know the nature or extent of any connection between Elena Cross and her father's business activities. I'm telling you what the records show. Cade stood up. Cade, Garrett said. I need to make a call. Sit. Garrett. His voice came out with an edge that he didn't try to file down. Lucy's placement move is scheduled for this morning. Elena is supposed to be present. I need to make a call. Garrett looked at him. Something moved across his face. The rapid calculation of a man determining whether stopping someone is worth the cost of stopping them. He unclasped his hands. Make the call. He stepped outside. Dialed Voss. She picked up on the second ring. Gerald Cross, he said. A silence that lasted 4 seconds. Where did you get that name? Bird, Meridian Capital Partners, managing member, Elena's father. He kept his voice flat. Is she involved? I don't know. Voss's voice had gone to the controlled place, the place past calm. I have been working with Elena Cross for 4 years. I have no reason to believe... She stopped. Started again. I don't know, Cade. I don't know, and I need an hour to find out, and in the meantime, I need the placement move to stop until I do.
Agreed. I'll call Denny. And Cade, she paused. Don't call Elena. Not yet. If she's clean, we tell her everything, and she deserves the explanation. If she's not, I know. He called Denny, told him to hold on the move. Denny asked why. Cade said he'd explain later and held the discomfort of Denny having to trust that without the reason, which was the discomfort of having been trusted the same way by multiple people over the past several days and knowing what it cost. He went back inside. Bird was still at the table. Garrett had poured him a coffee, which was the Iron Saints version of a diplomatic gesture. Not forgiveness, not absolution, just the acknowledgement that a man who came to give information he didn't have to give was still a man. If you were Galloway's registered agent and you didn't know, Cade said, sitting back down, why did you call Harrow after our conversation? Bird looked at him. I didn't call Harrow. Someone from your firm did. The Gallo was moved 2 days after I talked to you. I know. Bird's jaw tightened. I've been through my firm's call logs this morning. My junior associate, a man I hired 3 years ago, made a call to Harrow's personal number the evening after our conversation. He's been with the firm for 3 years. His prior employment was with Meridian Capital Partners. The room absorbed that. He's been inside your firm for 3 years, Cade said. Yes. Watching for exactly this kind of situation. Bird's face did something complicated and painful. Yes. Garrett looked at the table, then at Bird, then at Cade. The expression was not anger. It was beyond anger, at the altitude where anger becomes something colder and more structural. How do we know you didn't know about the associate? He said. Quiet. Direct. You don't, Bird said. That's the honest answer. You don't know. I'm asking you to consider that the honest answer is worth something. He paused. And I'm telling you that I'm going to spend whatever time I have left professionally dismantling every connection between my firm and anything related to Galloway or Meridian, and I'm going to do it on the record, in cooperation with the federal investigation, starting this morning. He looked at Cade. I know what that costs me. I'm doing it anyway. Cade looked at him for a moment. He thought about the thing Bird had said on the phone 2 nights ago. The thing about his daughters, 8 and 11, and how he'd ended the call after it because there wasn't anything else to say that was more important than that. Then start today, Cade said. Voss called back in 53 minutes. Cade took it outside again. The cold had softened slightly from the brutal degree of the night. It was now simply cold rather than aggressively cold, a distinction that felt meaningful after the past several hours. Elena's clean, Voss said. And in her voice he heard something that was relief and something that was the specific complexity of relief when you've been holding a fear about someone you've trusted for 4 years, and the fear turns out to be unfounded. Her father's connection to Meridian is real and documented. Her awareness of it is not. She cut contact with Gerald Cross 7 years ago. There's a restraining order in the civil court record that his attorneys got sealed, which is why it didn't surface easily. She went into child advocacy work specifically because of things she learned about her father's business, that she couldn't prove and couldn't report because she was 24 years old and nobody was going to listen. Voss paused. She's been trying to find this thing from the inside for 7 years. He stood in the cold with the phone and let that settle. She didn't tell you, he said. No, she didn't tell me. Voss's voice had a quality he couldn't quite name. She didn't tell me because she didn't know if I was safe to tell. She was doing the same thing I was doing, running the trust calculation and coming up uncertain. A pause. We've both been in the same building for 4 years trying to find the same thing, and we didn't know about each other. He thought about Elena's voice when she'd called him. The briskness of it, the precision, the way she'd given him Lucy's descriptions like she was handing over something she'd been holding too long in both hands. Tell her, he said. I'm on my way to her now. A pause. The placement move can proceed. I want to be there. I'll meet you. Ruth's farmhouse in the afternoon light looked the way farmhouses look in Michigan in November, tired and functional and connected to the land in a way that doesn't require beauty to be real. The pipes worked, the heat worked. There were 3 bedrooms upstairs and a kitchen that still had Ruth's spice jars on the rack above the stove, and a living room with a couch that had been there since the 80s, and had the specific sag of furniture that had been used rather than preserved. Denny had driven out ahead of them and turned everything on. He'd also, without being asked, put a box of crackers on the kitchen counter and a jar of peanut butter and a loaf of bread and a half-dozen juice boxes, because Denny had been thinking about what a child needed to find when she walked into an unfamiliar place and had arrived at the answer without anyone having to explain the question to him. Lucy came in between Voss and Elena. She was wearing different clothes than the night in the parking lot, clean ones, the right size. Someone at the hospital or the placement had seen to that. Her feet were in actual shoes. She walked with the careful, inventory-taking step of a child who has learned to read a new space before she commits to being in it. Eyes moving, exits, windows, the positions of the adults, the distances between things. She stopped in the kitchen doorway. She looked at the crackers on the counter. Something in her face shifted. Not happiness exactly, but the recognition of an intention. Someone had put those there for her. The placement of them said, "We knew you were coming. We thought about what you might need." She looked at Cade. He was standing near the back wall, far enough that she had space, close enough that she could see him clearly. He'd taken the jacket off, the Iron Saints jacket, the patches, and left it on the bike. He was just a man in a flannel shirt with a scar on his jaw and hands that were too rough for his age and eyes that were tired in a way that had been building for longer than the past week. She looked at him for a long moment. "You came back?" she said. "Yeah," he said. She looked around the kitchen again, at Voss, at Elena, at Denny, who was standing near the door trying to make himself look smaller than he was, then back at Cade. "Is this your house?" she asked. "It belongs to a friend. You can stay here." "With you?" "I'll be nearby." She considered this with the gravity of a 6-year-old performing an assessment that most adults would find exhausting to sustain. Then she walked to the counter and picked up the box of crackers and looked at it and looked at Denny. "Did you put these here?" she asked him. Denny looked startled to be directly addressed. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Something moved across her face. Not a smile exactly, but the proximity of one. The topography that comes just before, when the face hasn't committed yet, but the direction is clear. She set the crackers back down carefully, in exactly the same spot she'd picked them up from. The federal investigation that followed took shape over the next 3 weeks, in the way large investigations take shape. Not cleanly, not in a straight line, but in the accumulating, overlapping, ungainly way of something real. Gerald Cross was named in a federal complaint on a Thursday. Harrow was indicted on a Friday. The junior associate at Bird's firm was arrested the following Monday. Del Rourke and Thomas Rourke were charged together the week after that, and the courthouse steps photograph showed them in the specific shared expression of two people who have understood simultaneously that the story they were part of has ended in a way they didn't write. The Iron Saints were in the middle of all of it, whether they wanted to be or not. The initial news cycle, biker, child, suspicious behavior, had created a shape that the subsequent facts had to fight against, and facts fighting against established shapes is slow and unglamorous work. There were follow-up articles, some of them fair, some of them not, and there were 2 sponsors who didn't come back. And there was a 6-week period where Garrett fielded calls he described only as irritating and handled them with the specific patience of a man who has decided that every conversation is a version of a conversation he can wait out. Cade was not good at the waiting out part. He was better at other parts. He testified twice, once in a preliminary federal hearing, once in the state proceeding against Harrow's co-defendants. Both times he wore the Iron Saints jacket, and both times the attorneys for the other side made some version of an attempt to use the jacket as a character argument. And both times Voss's face, from the gallery, communicated a specific quality of contempt that he found steadying. Marcus Webb testified. He looked better than he had at the diner. Not rested, not fine, but better. Like a man who has set down something heavy and is still feeling where it was in his hands, but is nonetheless relieved to have set it down. He nodded at Cade in the hallway outside the courtroom, and Cade nodded back, and that was the entirety of what passed between them, which felt like the appropriate volume. Lawrence Bird cooperated fully. He spent 3 months doing it, and it cost him his largest clients and 2 of his senior partners who found the association untenable, and he did it without complaint, at least publicly, which Cade credited as a form of integrity even if it had arrived later than it should have. Elena Cross became someone Cade knew, not in a dramatic way, in the ordinary way of two people who have been through something significant together and discover afterward that they have a working language in common. She was precise and direct and had very little patience for institutional performativity, which Cade found compatible with his own approach. She was also, it turned out, funny in a dry, factual way that caught him off guard the first time and felt expected every time after that. She told him once, on the steps outside the courthouse after a long afternoon of procedural testimony, that she'd spent 7 years building a case file about her father's business on personal hard drives and in encrypted documents that she'd never been able to figure out how to use. "I had the shape of it," she said. "I just didn't have anyone to hand it to." She said it without visible emotion, which he understood by now was her version of visible emotion. "You handed it to the right people," he said. "Eventually," she said, and that was the whole conversation. Voss and Elena had several long conversations in the weeks after Aldenmore that Cade was not part of and did not ask about. What came out of those conversations was a trust that seemed to run deeper than professional, the kind that comes from discovering that someone you've been working near has been carrying the same thing you've been carrying and you just didn't know it yet. The Iron Saint's reputation repaired itself the way reputations repair after they've been damaged by the truth coming out. Slowly, imperfectly, in ways that left marks. Some people who distanced themselves came back. Some didn't. The $37,000 they'd raised for Sunrise Promise became a matter of court record rather than pride, which was a particular kind of loss that the club processed in their own way, which was mainly not talking about it and making sure the next charitable endeavor was chosen with a scrutiny that bordered on forensic. Boyd, who had been the one to shake Harrow's hand at the banquet photograph, didn't talk about it once. Not once, in all the weeks that followed. He worked on bikes in the secondary garage and showed up when he was needed and handled the weight of it in the manner of a man who had decided that carrying something was not the same as being defined by it. Denny updated his preservation database with a new field that nobody who used the platform understood, but that he never explained. A secondary ownership verification flag that cross-referenced property registrations against parent company networks. It made the documentation slower and more complicated and more accurate. He mentioned it to Cade once, briefly, and didn't mention it again. Pike, who had circled the hunting lodge through the tree line at 3 a.m. and texted about the generator without commentary, became the person Lucy was least afraid of among the Iron Saints outside Cade, which Cade suspected was because Pike never talked down to her and never talked around her, and when she asked him a direct question, gave her a direct answer, which she was good at recognizing and responded to. She asked Pike once, on an afternoon when several of the club had come to the farmhouse to do maintenance work that Ruth's property genuinely needed, how he hurt his back. Pike looked at her for a moment and then said, "Army, a long time ago." She nodded and thought about it and said, "Does it still hurt?" And he said, "Sometimes," and she said, "Mine does too." And he said, "I know." And that was all. Cade drove to the farmhouse most days, not always for long, sometimes just to check that everything was working, that the heat was holding, that Denny's crackers on the counter were being restocked. Sometimes Lucy was doing the quiet activities that Elena had described as her decompression behaviors, sorting small objects, drawing in a specific methodical way, arranging things into categories that had their own internal logic. Sometimes she was asleep, sometimes she was awake and wanted to talk, and sometimes she was awake and didn't. He learned not to force the second option. He was better at the sitting in the same room without agenda version of presence than he'd expected to be, possibly because it was structurally similar to several other things he'd done in his life that involved waiting and watching and not flinching. The guardianship process was slow and bureaucratic, and occasionally infuriating in the specific way that processes designed for institutions rather than people are infuriating when you are a person. Elena navigated it. Voss wrote a supporting statement that Cade read once and put away because the reading of it did something in his chest that he didn't want to do in public. A judge reviewed it. A court-appointed assessor visited the farmhouse twice and asked Lucy questions that Lucy answered with the specific careful honesty of a child who has been lied to enough times to understand that honesty is a form of power. The assessor wrote in her report,
The child demonstrates a clear, consistent, and unprompted positive attachment response to the proposed guardian. This is notable given documented history of adult trust deficits. The proposed guardian demonstrates appropriate emotional attunement without over-proximity. Placement is recommended. Cade read that one in the parking lot of the courthouse in his truck with the heat running and sat with it for a while. There was a hearing. There were forms.
There were signatures in the particular order that signatures go in when a system is doing something significant and wants a record of every moment of the doing. Afterward, Elena shook his hand and said, "Don't mess it up," in a tone that contained everything. He said, "I know," and she said, "Good," and that was enough. He drove to the farmhouse. Voss was there, finishing the last of the paperwork. She handed him the folder with an expression that was professional and controlled and slightly too tight at the corners to be purely professional, and he took it. Lucy was in the kitchen. She had the crackers on the table and was counting them for a reason that she didn't explain and that he didn't ask about. He sat down across from her and watched her count for a minute. "Hey," he said. She looked up. "Hey, I have some news." She stopped counting. Put the cracker she was holding down very carefully, aligned with the others. "Good news or other news?" "Good news." She looked at him steadily. The calculating eyes, the system running, the assessment of whether the claim of good news was consistent with available evidence. He held still and let the assessment run. "Okay," she said. Tentative. Conditional. The most honest okay he'd ever heard. "This is your house now, Sek," he said, "as long as you want it to be. And I'm going to be around." He paused. "Is that okay?" Another assessment, longer this time. Then she picked up the cracker she'd set down and held it out across the table to him. He took it. She went back to counting. Outside, the last of the afternoon was going gray and cold in the way it does in Michigan in November, the light giving up early and without ceremony. The farmhouse heat ran steadily. The spice jars on Ruth's rack were in their same order. From somewhere down the county road, very distant and then less distant, came the sound of Harleys, Denny and Boyd, coming out for the maintenance work that the back porch railing had needed for a month, arriving the same way they always arrived anywhere, with more noise than strictly necessary and without apology. Lucy looked at the window when she heard them, then back at her crackers. "Those are your friends," she said. Not a question. "Yes." She sorted the last cracker into its group, surveyed the arrangement, satisfied with something about it that was hers alone to understand. She began putting them back into the box with the same care she'd used to take them out. "Okay," she said again. And this time the words sat differently. Still careful, still conditional, but heavier on one end, like something had shifted its weight distribution toward forward. Winter held through February and into March, the way Michigan winters do. Longer than you plan for, colder than you remember. The kind of season that makes you doubt the existence of anything else until the morning it finally breaks and you realize you'd stopped believing in warmth without noticing. The trial began on a Tuesday in late January and lasted 11 days. Vincent Harrow sat at the defense table in a charcoal suit and listened to the federal prosecutor lay out 8 years of financial architecture with the expression of a man who had decided that stillness was his last available form of dignity. Gerald Cross was tried separately, in federal court, on charges that carried more weight and produced more silence in the room when they were read aloud. Del Rourke took a plea. Thomas Rourke did not, and lost. Cade testified on the 4th day. He wore the Iron Saints jacket. The defense attorney made one attempt to characterize it, and Voss from the gallery watched with an expression that the attorney apparently read correctly because he moved on. Harrow was convicted on all counts. He heard the verdict with the same stillness he'd carried for 11 days, and when they let him out, he didn't look at anyone in the gallery. Not at Cade, not at Voss, not at Elena, who sat 2 rows behind Cade with her hands folded in her lap and her jaw set at an angle that said she had been waiting 7 years for this specific moment, and now that it was here, she wasn't going to waste it on anything as simple as satisfaction. Outside the courthouse, the winter air hit hard and clean. Voss came down the steps behind him and stood beside him on the sidewalk without speaking for a moment. A car passed. Someone's exhaust steamed in the cold. "Cross gets sentencing in March," she said. "I know. You're not required to be there." "I know that too. She looked at him sideways. You'll be there. Probably. She pulled her coat tighter. The 5 kids from Alden Moore, the family placement for the 2 siblings was finalized last week. The older boy, the one who asked if you were with them, he's enrolled in school. She paused. Elena told me he asked his new foster mother if the man with the motorcycle was going to visit. She didn't know who he meant. Cade looked at the empty street. I'll reach out to the placement coordinator. I figured you would. Voss turned up her collar against the wind. How's Lucy? He thought about how to answer that honestly. Some days are harder than others, he said. She still checks the exits when she walks into a room. She still keeps crackers in 3 different places around the house because she's not sure yet that there will be more when those run out. He paused. She slept through the night 4 times last week. That's new. Voss nodded, said nothing for a moment. And you? He hadn't been asked that in a while, by anyone. Some days are harder than others, he said again, which was the same answer and also a different one. She looked at him directly. You did something that most people wouldn't have, she said. It came out plainly, without ceremony, the way she said most things. I want you to know that I know that. You did the same thing. I had a badge and a mandate. You had a cold parking lot and a kid who asked you if you were going to kill her. She held his gaze for a moment, then she looked away. Get home before this gets worse, she said, meaning the weather, which was doing something gray and threatening at the horizon. He drove back to the farmhouse. The months had changed it. Small things. A drawing taped to the refrigerator, the particular way certain cabinet doors didn't close all the way because they'd been opened and closed so many times by small hands that they'd learned a new position. A second set of boot prints in the mud near the back door that were a child's size and ran parallel to his own from the driveway to the porch. Ruth had come back in February briefly to retrieve some things and had stayed 3 days and spent most of them in the kitchen teaching Lucy to make things that Lucy had written down in a small notebook in handwriting that was still learning its own shape. The notebook lived on the kitchen counter next to the crackers. That evening, after dinner, Cade was doing the dishes when he heard Lucy behind him. She'd been quiet through most of the meal. The trial had been on the news, and she'd seen a photograph of Harrow on the screen before he could change the channel, and she had looked at it for 2 seconds and then looked at her plate and not said anything. He'd turned it off. They'd eaten. She'd helped clear the table, which she did now without being asked. He heard her open the cabinet where he kept the crackers, the kitchen stock, the main one. He heard her count them under her breath, which she still did sometimes. A habit she was keeping, not because she needed to, but because the keeping of it was still what safety felt like, and he wasn't going to argue with what safety felt like. Then he heard the cabinet close. He heard her cross the kitchen floor, her socks on the linoleum, the particular sound of a small person moving with deliberate intention. She stopped beside him at the sink. She picked up the dish towel and started drying the plate he'd just rinsed without being asked. They worked like that for a while. Him washing, her drying, the water running, and the window above the sink showing the dark of the yard and the bare trees and the sky beyond them doing something that might be clearing, might be more cloud. He's going to jail for a long time, she said. She didn't say the name. Yes, Cade said. She dried a glass carefully, set it in the rack. And the other one? Not a question. Also yes. She picked up another glass. He watched her hands on it. Small, careful, still slightly too precise in the way she handled things, the way children handle things when they've learned that broken means gone. Okay, she said. That was all. Just okay. But he was learning the weight of her okays by now, the way they varied. The provisional ones, the uncertain ones, the one that meant I'm deciding to believe this. This one was different from all of those. This one had an exhale in it. The particular quality of breath that comes when a held thing is finally set down. He handed her the last dish. She dried it and put it away and hung the towel back on the hook, and then stood there for a moment with her hands loose at her sides in the kitchen light. Then she crossed to him, and without ceremony, without announcement, she slid her small hand into his scarred one and held it. He went very still. "Good night, Dad," she said, quietly. The word arrived without preamble, without drama, like a thing she'd been trying out in private for long enough that saying it out loud had finally become smaller than not saying it. He stood in the kitchen with her hand in his, and something moved through him that had no clean name. Not happiness exactly, not relief. Something that had been built slowly out of cold parking lots and all-night drives, and the specific weight of 5 children in a building with a generator running, and the sound of Harleys arriving when they were needed, and all the ordinary, unremarkable days between then and now, where nothing dramatic happened and everything important did. "Good night," he said. She let go, went upstairs. He heard her footsteps cross to her room, heard the sound of a small person making themselves comfortable in a space that had gradually, day by day, become theirs. He turned off the kitchen light, stood for a moment in the dark with the window showing the yard. Outside, headlights swept the far end of the county road. Then the sound, low, steady, unmistakable, the rolling thunder of Harleys moving in the dark. Denny and Boyd, maybe Garrett, coming back from wherever the road had taken them tonight, passing on their way through, the way they did now sometimes, the way people do when a place has become familiar enough to route through without needing a reason. The sound swelled and then began to fall away. The engines fading into the distance, the way engines do in the dark, when you're standing in a warm house and they're moving on into the cold. He listened until he couldn't anymore. Then he went to lock the front door, checked the back, and walked upstairs in the dark of a house that smelled like coffee and dish soap and the faint trace of a child's shampoo, and the Iron Saints rode on into whatever the night held next. Not outlaws, not legends, not the story anyone had written about them. Just men who had learned, in the long way you learn the things that matter, that the difference between dangerous and safe is not what you're capable of. It's what you choose to do with it. And somewhere behind them, in a farmhouse off a county road that didn't appear on most maps, a little girl slept through the night.